Young people getting addicted to their smartphones is rapidly growing.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Scorpion Movement podcast, episode 24. For this podcast, we have Matthew Adams, who is currently running for the California State Assembly. He is a lifelong Woodbridge resident, educator, and a community organizer who is currently running for the Assembly. And the main goals of his campaign are actually to prioritize people over corporate interest and reduce the influence of big money in politics. So we've been interested in talking to Matthew Adams for quite a long time because it's quite interesting to gain a perspective of modern political climates in this very tumultuous political candidates in this very tumultuous climate that we currently have. And I believe grants us a bigger perspective of where politics is in the United States and internationally. Commonly in these local communities where the needs are so often underestimated and people are not given a voice to truly express what their community wants. So we've got on Jordan back here for the podcast, and he is formally invited back into the show so that he can ask some of the more questions. So we've got
Yeah.
both of the regular co-hosts, and we've of course got Matthew. So Matthew, I believe I did a pretty good introduction for you. If I, don't stroke my own cereal for a second here and actually let you talk. So I let you just sort of introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us a bit about yourself. Say, where you come from, what your interests are, and primarily what you want to do for the people of California.
Yeah, that was a pretty good intro right there from the website. Covered all the things that I would have said myself there, so appreciate it. And yeah, happy to be on the podcast. Looking forward to the conversation we'll have. As you said, I've lived in Woodbridge most of my life, which nobody knows where that is outside of even most of California. It's about 40 minutes south of our capital, Sacramento, and it's in the Central Valley of California. So that extends, my district that I am running in is pretty Republican area. So a lot of the areas surrounding it are pretty Democratic, like most of California is in most people's eyes, and like the political leaning of the state is. But this is one of the few conservative areas in the country. So the assembly member that I am challenging, his name is Heath Flora. He is a Republican incumbent. He's actually the minority leader in the assembly. And I am challenging him because, as you said, I am hoping to limit the influence of money in politics. It's pervasive all over American politics, global politics, right? I think a lot of us are aware of the problem of that, and it's very popular to try and remove the influence. But if you are entrenched, if you are somebody that's very powerful in politics, it's very hard to disentangle yourself from that. The current representation that our district has is very much entangled in that. The guy that I'm running against has several scandals related to finance, political, extramarital affairs with lobbyists. Like the corruption is real and it has greatly impacted what the representation our district gets. So, as you said, that's my main issue. Other main issues that I'd like to focus on because of where our area is. We're a very rural area, so agriculture, water issues are huge for us. Healthcare, rising costs is kind of everywhere, also affects our area. Education, the quality of that has not been as good as everyone would like. We're not really managing our money great on that front. And then, cost of living, all of those things that a lot of people would say affect their community, of course, affects mine as well.
Yeah, that is a pretty good introduction of sort of the goals that you sort of have for this campaign. It must be quite challenging to actually challenge the incumbent minority leader for the actual state assembly of California, because it not only puts you in the position where you have to fight on a local political scale, but also puts like the view of your campaign onto the state level, since this is inevitably something that is going to impact a lot of people statewide. It is quite interesting and it's quite interesting fact that a lot of people don't realize about the state politics of California is that the areas around Sacramento, so I have allegedly heard and just confirmed by what you were saying, are more Republican leaning. People forget that the state, they had Arnold as governor. You guys had Arnold as governor
Right.
not so long ago, and he was not a Democrat, if I recall correctly. He was a Republican.
That's right. He was actually the last Republican to win a statewide election, and you could say that, and you'd be correct that a lot of that was based on his star power. But the fact remains, a Republican was elected as governor of California only 15-ish years ago,
Which seems
and
crazy.
there are several pockets of the state that are deeply conservative, which I don't know if you've been following the redistricting efforts that are going on in California.
A little bit, yeah, I
There's
heard about it.
Yeah, we have Proposition 50 coming up in November, which is going to On the federal level for Congress, so this wouldn't affect my race for assembly or the other house of the legislature in California, which would be the state Senate. But the Congress on the federal level, there's a lot of districts that are Republican in California that would be changed as a result of the redistricting effort that Governor Newsom is trying to get passed through a state referendum, which would lower that number. But the fact that there are so many around to play with in the first place just goes to show if you think of California as only liberal, you're missing a large part of what our state is, and that's one of my districts.
Yeah, it's an interesting fact, the redistricting efforts and how they can be so controversial, like nationwide. Because back in Florida, where me and Jordan had met, back in like 2019 or 2020, I believe they split forward one of the like the largest Republican districts in the state, which is around the area of Broward and Miami, particularly
Mhm.
South Miami, and they split it into three. So now there are three different Republican districts that exist there. And coincidentally, that was done under a Republican governor, Ron DeSantis, who I had happened to meet and talk to several times in the past. And then they also had the vast majority of the Florida like actual like state Congress also passed those laws. So it was a sort of like controversial little issue because Broward is a mostly Democratic area, and then there were a lot of people that were quite upset that they were now surrounded by several Republican districts that were going to outvote them in every single election.
So,
So it is quite
yeah.
interesting how those things develop, and I'm quite
Well, I
interested
had
to
a
see how
question for
that's going to
Matt
go
after
for
this, but go
California.
ahead. Because
Yeah.
But just jumping back into the conversation, we addressed some of the specific goals for your campaign and the things that you want to do for your actual state. There's a huge thing with like campaign finance laws. You talked
Yeah.
about keeping big money out of politics, and there's obviously is a lot of corruption in every single like even statewide or nationwide system in America because a lot of people tend to just sort of be aware that a lot of the politicians that currently get appointed to our Congress or state senates or whatnot, they are basically appointed there by lobbyists and big interest groups that just want the laws to that advantage them personally to get passed. And there's
Yeah.
really not a lot of democratic representation per se. So in a state like California, and a reminder, the state where a Republican governor was only elected within the last like 2 decades or so, the state where Richard Nixon is from, a state that has historically been Republican but has now become a very strong Democratic stronghold with some Republican remnants. With a a position like this where you're in a very strongly blue state but you're running in a small red pocket, what challenges do you encounter with these big money interests, and what specifically made you want to target them in your campaign?
Yeah, there's a lot of difficulty in this race regarding money. So to put some numbers out there, the guy that I'm running against, like I said, minority leader, very well connected, been in office for about 10 years. In his campaign account right now, he's got a little over $1 million. And if you want to challenge him, the financial state of the race means you'd have to have at least 10% of that, which would be about $100,000 in your campaign account to make it competitive. That's probably where a lot of the groups in the area, a lot of the clubs would be looking towards viability. They want to see like how much of a chance does this guy have against a well-funded incumbent that is entrenched. You'd need about $100,000 raised either from your own pocket or from the community. I'm not taking corporate donations, so that puts a limit on the amount of money that I have access to. And when I'm talking to people trying to go, face to face, I've gone to several different Democratic clubs, union clubs, various community organizations to try and make my case, introduce myself to people. The question that a lot of people have is, how successful do you think you're going to be? Like, what's your plan to actually combat all of this money? And my answer to that is essentially, I'm not going to win this race based on the money. I'm never going to catch up. I'm never going to get that amount of money that he has or get anywhere close to it. And that's just a reality that I'm going to have to face because even if I were to get as much money as he has right now, he's going to keep raising, he's going to keep connecting, and he's going to get more and more if he thinks that that's going to be enough to beat what I'm challenging him with. What we win on is going to be on the issues and the ethics. I think what is bipartisan, something that you can reach across the aisle with, is, as you said, the idea that a lot of people already hold our politicians are corrupt and they don't represent us. Most people are very unaware of their state legislature. They just either don't really care about it at all, or if they know anything about it, they don't know any of the people that represent them. That's very much the case in this district. Even among well-connected people that I talk to in various clubs and organizations, they say like, "Oh, who's running this? Who's our district member right now?" And I'll have to remind them, I'm like, "Oh, okay." And they don't really know anything about him. I remind them about some of the scandals that he had, and they're like, "Oh wow, that guy's awful," right? And it's like, "Yeah, right, that guy's awful." And the more that the word gets out about the corruption and the personal dealings that this guy has, as well as not even just his personal conduct, his legislative votes on various issues that I could highlight later, the more people know about this guy, the less they like him, and that makes this more viable and easier to have those conversations. Because if I'm going to people that are right-leaning or outright Republican, and I introduce myself as a Democratic candidate, I've already lost a lot of people right there, right? Because people just aren't willing to engage with people of the other party. And it's sad that partisanship has risen as much as it has in the last couple of decades. But again, that's just the fact of the matter. People oftentimes just won't engage with people from the other party. And that's both parties, not just Republicans, Democrats as well. So you need to make sure that when you're introducing yourself and you're presenting yourself, you're not coming at it like, I am here to convince you that your party is wrong. It's like, look at what you're getting right now in terms of representation. I think we can do better and then build from there on what we can connect on. And that's the goal of this race.
Yeah, definitely. No, I can see that there's a lot of like a lack of want to work across the aisle, particularly because, from my perspective, and in my opinion, it is the Republican Party who has been like radicalizing for the past around 10 years. All of the efforts of American politics have been centered largely around like Donald Trump and his
Yeah,
diehard supporters, and there has like been very clear and concrete tension that has happened between the left and the right as a result of that polarization. Jordan, I
yeah.
know you had some questions that you wanted to ask and
Yeah,
talk
well,
about.
I've one question. I just managed to actually phrase it in a more elegant manner. So there seems to be a very prevalent misconception as to the ideological and electoral makeup or composition, you could say, of the actual state of California, particularly with respect to its residents, to its demographics. I'd say that broadly speaking, the state's population is often the target of stereotypes that portray it as being almost archetypally or radically left-leaning, far to the
Mhm.
left. But as you stated earlier, this isn't actually universally the case. Perhaps it applies to certain pockets of the country, certain regions, maybe the metro areas, like the LA metro area, for instance, the San Francisco area. But you yourself have actually stated that, again, it's far from being a universally accurate descriptor that really holds true when it comes to the totality, the entirety of the state and all of its regions. So, in this regard, this particularly intriguing to me because I've lived in California in the past. And obviously, I'm not going to delve into all the personal details because it's not really necessary here. But I have lived in places like Orange County. I have spent a lot of time corresponding in places like LA County just because they border each other. And there's
Yeah.
definitely a pretty sizable, not necessarily right-leaning, because even the term right-leaning itself is relative, but there's a sizable Republican contingent I think gets ignored sometimes in media. And I think that many
Yeah.
Americans are actually unaware of this, despite the fact that California is one of the most important states. So if possible, maybe you could expand on the nature of this gap between the reality at hand and these types of misconceptions and where that gap may have actually came from, where the misconceptions may have came from in the first place, and how that manifests in your region, basically, in the Central Valley, which I'm not that familiar with, to be honest, just to put that out there. But
Many
yeah,
aren't. It's not a particularly high interest area for a lot of people. As I said, it's
yeah,
pretty rural or agricultural. There's not as many media markets here that
yeah,
have generated a lot of interest. So I don't blame anybody for not being familiar with the Central Valley. If I didn't live here, I
yeah.
wouldn't be myself, I'm sure.
Well, generally speaking, not to interrupt, I think it would be better on average when it comes to basically any issue. It would be better if people were more curious than they are, probably, more curious than
Oh,
they are now.
absolutely.
That's what I'd
That's
say
across the board,
about
not just in
basically,
politics, just in
yeah, across
general.
the board. So yeah,
Yeah.
but anyways, go ahead. Sorry about that.
No, no, I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
I think where the misconception comes from is oftentimes a failure in how politics is covered in our country. Most of the time, for the average voter, they don't think about politics unless they're thinking about the presidential race, right? The average
yeah,
voter just is only aware that politics happen every 4 years. And even then, it's only the last couple of months of a race that has been going on for usually a year and a half or so. They usually don't tune into the primary. They just kind of tune in. It's like, all right, it's September, before the big election. Let's check what's going on. And then they'll watch the coverage, on election night and see the blue and the red fill in the various maps, and they'll say like, okay, these are the Democratic states and these are Republican states, and I won't really think about it beyond that too much. But if they were to look a little more into the coverage, if they were to follow the race further along, then they would see like, okay, yes, California is Democratic overall, right? But it's like a 60-40 split when it comes to the presidential vote. We're one of the largest states population-wise in the union. That's millions of people that are voting Republican in that state that you just wouldn't see represented on that particular map, right? When most people are paying attention to the race or politics in general, And, the governor is a Democrat most of the time in California. Nancy Pelosi's from California. There's all sorts of indicators. It's like, if I'm just looking at the surface level, that's all I'm going to see is Democrat, Democrat, Democrat. And that's correct, right, on the surface level. But for the people that live here, that's not our reality. And the other interesting thing is like, even if you're looking at the Democratic Party of California, it's easy to think like this state is so blue or this state is so liberal that it's like, oh, this is prime ground for Bernie Sanders, AOC, the Democratic Socialists. And
Yeah,
that's just simply not the case. I mean, you've lived in LA, and as democratic as that city is, it's not super far left. I've worked a lot in the Bay Area in San Francisco. Most of the
yeah,
Democrats there are relatively moderate. Again, like that's that land of Nancy Pelosi and that sort of democratic politics. They usually tend to play it
yeah,
more safe than I think a lot of people
yeah.
would
They're
imagine.
not, yeah. They're not particularly far left. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, they're not particularly far
Moderate.
left. And Republicans, to speak about them on the California level, they're also probably not that far right. If you were to imagine, like, well, they're a minority party and they don't get heard anyway, it must be because they're crazy or very far left. That's usually not the case either, because they have to be savvy enough to hold on to any power that they have in California. A lot of the Republicans are closer to the center than Republicans in, Kansas or Alabama or one of those places that are heavily Republican. Uh,
Definitely.
so it's not representing kind of the narrative that you would necessarily see of what each party is, because the numbers are so skewed that it gets a little wonky in both directions.
Yeah, I see. That makes sense. That's an interesting way to think about it. But at the same time, though, the conception or the idea that perhaps not necessarily all the politicians, because as you've mentioned, many most prominent and powerful politicians in California, people who actually assume certain seats in a sense, certain electoral seats, are not as rad left, are not as radically far left as I might initially assume them to be. In fact, they're not even on the level of the self-described democratic socialists like AOC, Bernie, some of the other politicians that you mentioned, or probably more East Coast in nature. That could be another
Yeah,
topic to actually dive into, really, the vibe between the two coasts, because there is also this idea, just as a thread that I would like to follow, perhaps throughout the duration of this conversation. There's this idea that the coasts are basically homogeneous when it comes to ideology, and that the main political divide, at least insofar as ideology is concerned, and then with that representation, electoral politics in America is and has been for a long time actually a battle between coastal elites, which is the term that gets thrown around a lot, and the interior, the country's interior, the rural heart. And people,
yeah.
they sometimes map it onto Democrat to Republican, but I think it goes deeper than that. That could be an interesting thread to explore here.
Yeah,
But putting that
Loki,
aside from that,
can we actually
mo
touch on the main differences between like the Northeast Democratic Socialists
yeah,
and then the
but
West
before
Coast
we,
Democrats? Because I feel like that's
yeah,
a really important thread to touch down upon.
yeah, but before we do that, though, let me just say this is really the point I was trying to make initially. Now that I'm actually arriving at it, I'll be clear here, and I'll be more brief here, and I'll say that abbreviated. And I'll say that it seems to be the case that many people still think that even if these politicians themselves, these elected appointed politicians, aren't particularly far left, the actual population of California, people think is very far left, if not one
Yeah.
of the most left-leaning populations in the country. But I don't know if you think that that's an accurate reading or not. And if that's the case, then why do you think that there's a gap between the actual composition of the electorate, the state electorate, and the constituency, basically? Because per the norms, in a sense, per democratic norms and the basic idea of democratic politics, you'd expect there to be more of a match. You'd expect it to be more equal in proportion in nature, but it seems like it might not be the case unless people are just biased about this, aren't thinking rationally, and uh, and exhibiting a disproportionate focus on very marginal coastal areas or urban areas that aren't actually that, perhaps not as important as they may seem to be in the grand scheme of affairs.
Yeah,
So
shortly before we
go ahead.
let
I mean, if you have thoughts
Matthew
on those types
answer
of
the
issues.
actual question and
Yeah, that's the question.
elaborate
I
on
mean,
that,
it's a
shortly
little bit
before that,
long-winded.
I'd just like to add a little bit to that, where there's this perception that I've noticed that a lot of people think like California is the super left state. But if we actually go down that like left to right axis and we try to put everything on that, there's a really good argument that like some parts of New York City and like Brooklyn and those areas that are bordering it are more like Democratic stronghold, not even Democratic, like more left-wing contingents. And then we had like places like Atlanta, and we've had places where the former like Black Panther Party operated. There's a lot of places around the
Yeah.
United States that carry that reputation, and it's quite intriguing how California has recently like amalgamated that reputation of being like this very, very, communist dictatorship ran by Gavin Newsom almost among Republicans. So Matthew, I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts about this.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll try and take it piece by piece here. I think starting with the last thing first, again, I think that just comes down to the media perception that California very much is cultivating, right? It's no accident that when you're thinking of liberal strongholds, California does come to mind. Obviously, population-wise, they certainly are in the conversation, right? But it's interesting you mentioned, right? Like Black Panther Party was based out of Oakland in California, right? That's where it was born. And that's very much not the politics of our state, right? Oakland's its own thing. It's a very liberal area. Very far left politician Barbara Lee is the mayor there, right? Certain pockets of California do embody that. So it would be wrong to say nowhere in California represents that. But I think you're right. Other areas of the country represent that more. What California and Gavin Newsom and Hollywood and all of the media machine is trying to cultivate of California is like, particularly right now, when partisanship is incredibly high and there's a large outcry of Democrats asking for the party to do something and stand up against Trump. California Democrats are very smartly saying, we're the ones that are doing something. Look at all this. Look at all the shows we're on. Look at all the referendums we're putting out. Look at all the ads we're buying. We're the ones that you want to turn to because we are the ones that will win the White House, flip the Senate, flip the House. It's all marketing, right? There's a little bit of kernel of truth in that, absolutely, but it's all a little bit of spin, right? The other part, I'm forgetting some of the parts of the question that you asked, Jordan. So if you could remind me like what the general gist
No,
of the question was
I
again.
guess
I'm sorry.
there were two main parts, there were two main components of the question. One being whether or not it's true that a significant portion of the constituency, the California electoral constituency is actually as far left as they're made out to be.
Oh, yes.
And then two, whether or not there exists that gap that I actually alluded to, a gap perhaps between the interests of the politicians themselves and the people of California.
Right. So
Those are the two
for the
major components.
politicians, yeah, for the politicians themselves, it's hard to pin down what politicians actually believe. I think you can interview them, you can watch podcasts with them, you can talk to them directly at town halls, and you're not going to get their real beliefs probably ever. It again comes back down to the spin of like what we often want from people in politics and also just celebrity culture, or online culture in general is authenticity, right? It's like we want people that are real and we want people that speak their truth or, speak from the heart. That's a lot of the reason why Trump is so popular because people think whether he's right or wrong, and a lot of times he is wrong, we believe, at least believes what he's saying and tells it, quote, tells it like it is, right? It's rare that you find someone in politics that people believe that about. And I think there's good reason that people have hesitancy because politicians and public figures in general are cultivated figures, right? They spend a lot of money on their PR with their campaign consultants to present their story a certain way. It seems like everybody is a small business owner or everybody is a farmer when you reach a certain thing, and it's like everybody has a certain things that they check off their life story box, and it's like this can't be the only people ever that run for office is lawyers or farmers or small business owners who are all Christian and go to church every Sunday. Like that just doesn't seem true based on just the makeup of our population. How can that be the only people that are running to represent us? And it's not, but it's what they believe sells the best. And if you look at the results, that is what sells the best. So not knowing exactly what they believe, right? But taking them a little at their word, do they represent the communities that they serve? Sometimes, right? I think, and again, this is both parties. There's really not one finger or the other you can point to either party to say either is one more authentic than the other. They're usually just playing catch up. They have their own ideas, and most of the time they're just following the lead of what they see from their polling, what they see online, and choosing on whether or not this is an issue that they think that they actually want to run on. Like, how long did it take for healthcare costs to become the issue that Obama was like, okay, this is going to be the central issue of my campaign. We're going to make universal healthcare a thing. The Affordable Care Act is going to pass, and that's what I'm going to stake my presidency on. Presidents have talked about that for decades. Bill Clinton talked about that in the 90s. I mean, Mitt Romney as a governor in Massachusetts as a Republican talked about it in the early 2000s. And ultimately, like, things didn't particularly change. The moment was met at that time. It'd been popular for years that it's just like now it's reached a critical mass, or it's like we probably can't ignore this anymore. It's rare that issues reach that point, but when they do, change happens all of a sudden. Like if you look at political history over the course of, modern American politics, change kind of happens all at once or not at all when it could be happening all the time. If politicians actually responded to every concern that their constituents had when they had them, change would be much more fluid than it is. But it stops and starts and stops and starts because they always have to check in. It's like, is now the right time? Should we move forward on this now? And that leads to a lot of times like a bottleneck of like actual problems that continue to pile up that just aren't as popular as some of the other problems. And it's like everyone's talking about inflation right now. And how long have we talked about inflation and not done anything about it? Like cost of grocery prices are going up, gas is going up. There's things that can be done on that front, but if that's not something that they feel they can really win on, they're not going to do anything about it. So it's tough.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to inflation, I mean, not to go too off topic here, but I have pretty radical views on that topic because I'm not sure if many people who watch this podcast actually knows about me, but I'm basically a modern monetarist, which means I actually believe in modern monetary theory. I mean, deep down, I'm more of an anti-capitalist who just thinks we should go full economic abolitionism, I mean, not really anarchism. I have specific views I need to flesh out. I might write some type of Substack about this to clarify. But I think if we have to operate within the framework of the market and of these capitalist institutions as we know them, I think the best approach is actually basically modern monetary theory. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but very interesting. I think everyone who's watching this podcast should check it out. I mean, it's not really the right time to actually delve into this in any detail, but the idea is that governments don't really need to adhere to budget deficits. And the concept of a budget deficit doesn't really make any sense because the government is not equivalent to a consumer, to any other spenders in the economy. And they can basically do whatever they would like with their money, which would mean that inflation is not really a legitimate concern. But it's a weirder doctrine. It's a little bit more fringe. But
Yeah.
when it comes to the economic questions, the point is, and the reason as to why I bring this up is I do think that there is actually a pretty clear solution to those economic types of problems. But I
Yeah.
just don't think that it's necessarily politically viable in contemporary
Right.
America because of how scared we are of the boogeyman of socialism and these types of ideas. I mean, my views are pretty far to, they've always been very far to the left on economics, more left-leaning than even people like AOC and Bernie Sanders, who are about as left-leaning as it gets when it comes to the economy. And that's essentially that's beyond the taboo, I think, in American politics to propagate these types of ideas.
I mean,
And you see
it's
that even
interesting. It's
people like,
interesting.
yeah,
When
go
you
ahead,
follow
Jacob. Yeah.
economic policy, it's interesting how actually moderate the taboo is, because
Yeah.
Yeah.
in a lot of
That-
rural parts of the United States, ironically, the people that will most benefit from such programs, just saying like universal healthcare just sounds like you're saying we're going to go back to Stalinist Russia. Like
yeah.
the basic concepts which are considered like pretty like even viable by right-wing parties in Europe, where I currently am right now, where they're guaranteed sort of are considered to be, on the progressive left in America. There's obviously a
Okay.
lot of issues on the progressive left in America that are still like progressive anywhere in the world. There are some countries
Sure.
where the progressive left is considering allowing women to drive. There are a lot of different parallels that we can make with
Yeah.
different places
It's
around the world.
definitely,
But as far as like economics go, the United States seems so intertwined in this like culture of the Cold War and this Red Scare, dare I say, where even thinking
yeah,
about the idea
exactly.
where the government provides you a little bit something more is considered like very taboo. It seems like the entire country is very economically libertarian in spirit, if not in, action and polling outcomes. Because when
Yeah, it
someone like
definitely
Trump,
is.
yeah, yeah, just quickly, when someone like Trump gets into office and they pivot to these people who are quote unquote like libertarian, a lot of the time they will elect him, even though Trump is a very big government type person. Even though he doesn't spend it on the right things, many might argue, like universal healthcare, he does spend a lot of money, as we see with like the big beautiful bill. The issue
Yeah.
is the entire spirit of like this economic libertarianism that we see all across the U.S. It doesn't really appear to me as, hating socialism and not wanting the government to spend money. It just seems to me like wanting to send a message to those big West Coast, East Coast elite liberals that we don't like. It's just this spirit of
Yeah.
like revanchism against the people that we don't like, rather than any actual understanding of the economic and monetary systems. So
There's a lot of that
Yeah.
belief in American politics where a lot of people, whether they admit it or not, aren't voting for their own self-interest. They're either voting aspirationally, they're voting for the millionaire that they could become, or to punish people that they feel are against them. And that's, you're right, that is directly tied to the rise of Trump and a lot of other moments in political events over the last couple of decades. The budget deficit is an interesting point that you bring up there because I agree. The budget is not as big of an issue as the right wing party would like you to believe a lot of time. I think when we get to the nitty gritty of what does the government do, like what is the role of the government in government spending, and how much does the budget deficit or surplus actually affect that? The answer is really not that much. That's also a modern problem. If you look at why the government has shut down at the federal level so much in the last couple of decades, it's tied down to suddenly we care a lot about our budget deficit. And, the Republican Party, the Tea Party, that right-wing grassroots movement is like, we can really run on this budget deficit as we have something on Obama or we have something on that we can win on. It's like they're not being responsible with money. We've decided that's a winning message. And then they're ultimately right. They won a lot of House seats and they got a lot of populist support because they were able to convince people it's like if the government has a big budget deficit, that is hurting you directly, the voter. And that's simply not true. Because if you're thinking about what the government is spending their money on, it's social services that directly impact people's lives, right? As a country, and as also in the state of California, when we're spending money, we're helping people. The budget deficit doesn't mean anything and doesn't actually affect anybody. I mean, if you the I don't really know how to phrase this in a way that's like, I don't know, correct or whatever, but a lot of the money's not even really real, right? I mean, there's a whole thing you can
Yeah.
go into that, but like the
Yeah, we can
services
into that
are
a bit.
though, right? Like Meals on Wheels that is directly getting to people, roads that are being built if that money wasn't being spent, homeless shelters that are being built, subsidizing healthcare costs, all that stuff is real and all that stuff does matter. And we've been able to convince a large amount of people that it's like, if we were to cut all that spending, we'd be better off because at least the budget would be balanced. But that really has no impact on your life. And then the last part of that, that's an interesting part, is like the tax rates are another thing that we've really managed to trick a lot of people on. And I say we, I just mean the government in general. I don't believe this, of course. But it's also relatively modern that we have such low income tax for our high brackets on income, right? I mean, you look back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, people who were millionaires, and there were a lot less of them than there are now, and there's reason for that, looking at the tax rates, right? They were paying way higher income tax rates for those upper brackets, which people also get confused by. It's like, oh, you're taking 90% of their total income if they get 90% of a tax bracket. And it's like, no, if it's money they make over $1 million, that stuff is 90% is what's taken, which is not as bad as it sounds. But anyway, long story short, right? These are all modern problems. We've managed to convince people that like the money that the government is taking is hurting you. So now to the point where the average voter, if you'd ask them, what do you want the government to do? A lot of people say, I just want the government to leave me alone. I want the government to not do anything. That's why most people don't vote. That's why a lot of people don't get involved in the process because they just think the government is bad and I don't want them to do anything for me. It was a winning message for Ronald Reagan to say, like, the
yeah.
worst thing you can hear is I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And that's, led to a real decline.
Hmm.
Oh, absolutely. Well, just to
Yeah,
clarify,
absolutely.
to add some points here, modern monetary theory is not, perhaps introduced somewhat improperly. It's not solely or even fundamentally a theory about the deficit. It's more so a theory about the money supply and the monetary system in particular, which states and which posits that the government is fundamentally in control of the money supply, and it doesn't actually need to be constrained or restrained by phenomena such as deficits, debt, inflation.
Yeah,
And
right.
inflation only really occurs insofar as the government actually allows that to happen, because through the central bank, it is in control of even the idea of value in a sense, and of how valuable any given unit of currency is actually conceived of, or is perceived to be by the population. So per modern monetary theory, the idea that inflation is just a natural or an inevitable result of printing more money, which is the standard viewpoint that actually still predominates mainstream or orthodox economics today in macroeconomics is somewhat incorrect. And I think that's, if not completely incorrect. And I think that's actually very important here because to tie back to what you were saying about how, and even to what Jacob was saying about how people nowadays seem to be very scared and have been for a long time of basically any type of social programs, expansions of the social safety net, with certain exceptions, because
Yeah.
obviously when it comes to what's happening to them at home, I think in the vast majority of cases, people will probably be very displeased to find that, for instance, the government is cutting or making massive cuts to funding of Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, these types of programs because they rely on them to such a significant extent. So at home and in their own personal lives, they would definitely be opposed to that. But on the more abstract level, it's as if that doesn't compute for them. It's as if the idea that there's some responsibility that they have to other people, to society, that they're not just these atomized individuals doesn't really compute and it doesn't really cohere in their own minds and in the way in which they think about American society and politics, which is pretty tragic. And I've long thought of to myself, well, where does that come from? Because on its face and on the surface of it, it seems so counterintuitive. Why would people be against social programs that aren't even trying to yield major changes, for instance, in how we relate to the economy on a more fundamental level? I mean, we're not entering full-blown Marxism here just because we're trying to give everyone healthcare through single-payer healthcare through the
Right.
types of policy that Bernie Sanders is proposing. That has basically nothing to do with Marxism. And I don't know how these types of labels got attached to those policies when if you actually go back and read Marx, if you read some of his early writings, he advocates against social democracy and social democratic policies because he thinks it's going to delay the revolution, whereas he actually wants to expedite it. So it's just completely wrong. People are completely misinformed of that. Bernie AOC to have nothing to do with Marxism in any way. I mean, we can talk about maybe, I think at best, Bernie pushes into what you could call a type of syndicalism, a labor syndicalism, because he does actually want to change the manner in which we think of companies and who actually owns stock in companies, which is really interesting. We can talk about that later on because, and the reason I bring up Bernie too is because I was wondering as to whether or not he might have been an influence on your approach to, or the key central theme of your campaign, which is to get money out of politics. So I'll save that for later as a note. But to go back to what I was saying, yeah, I've been trying to figure out where does this fear come from, the stigma come from, and because it's so counterintuitive, it doesn't really make any sense. Why would people vote for policies that would probably benefit them, regardless of whether or not they're a Democrat or Republican? Because I mean, obviously, there are lower class people, there are even middle class people on both sides who absolutely struggle when it comes to affording basic necessities of life, like healthcare, housing. We have a housing crisis in the US. So where does this come from? It's a major paradox. And I think Jacob was basically right when he said that decades of Cold War propaganda have not only brainwashed Americans, I mean, that might be a pretty harsh term to use, but basically forced many of us to live in the past. I mean, it seems as if many people still think that we're in this
That's
type
the
of
thing, and I just quickly want to
battleground.
interrupt. First of all,
Yeah,
of course I was right. I'm always right. But second of all, I feel
yeah,
like that's slowly fading because of our generation, Generation C. Because you can't really tell someone our age when we're in our 20s, dude, this is just like the Cold War. This is just like when the communists were trying to get us. And it's just like, what do you mean when the communists were trying? I don't even remember 9/11. It's like
Right. Now they're
yeah,
talking about China
yeah,
as the
so much
boogeyman,
time
right?
has
yeah.
passed from the
Well,
time
no,
that
but to be fair though,
these boomers
no, but
like
to be fair,
remember.
it varies from community to community because it's funny. You actually mentioned Broward and Miami and how there were these redistricting controversies. Well,
Yeah.
a pretty significant contingent of Miami is actually pretty far to the right when it comes to
Yeah,
economic
because they're
questions
Cuban.
because of
Because
They're
that
they're
from
Cuban
Cuba. You're
because
right.
they're
background. Yeah.
Cuban.
And it definitely, yeah. So the demographics make a huge difference because among
It's
even
this
Cubans
no,
here, they still have that
there's
fear.
this very weird
Yeah.
contingent of the Republican Party in Miami that we saw particularly, where it's based around I forgot the exact woman's name. It's not important because I wouldn't like to call it out either. But there is a small contingent of like Hispanic Americans who are very, very anti-immigration. And it seems
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
like the Republican Party shtick nowadays, where we get like each member of every single group to speak out for us and on behalf of us, so that if someone like calls us racist or if someone says that what we're doing is like hateful, we can get that member of that group to then say that that's not currently the case. And there's this small contingent of like Cubans in Miami that
Yeah.
are very right wing because they themselves believe that America will turn into their home country of Cuba as soon as I don't know, we raise taxes on their employers. So
Right.
something like that. And I don't mean to generalize broadly, but that is a trend that I think I have noticed. And seems to be like a reoccurring thing within the Republican Party nowadays, which is an interesting trend. But as Jordan was saying, like it
Where does it
definitely
come from? Yeah.
yeah, there definitely
Yeah.
are a lot of factors at play here. And Jordan, did you have like a question to
Well, I
talk
was
about?
just gonna say, I was
Are you
gonna ask Matthew,
brainwashed?
fundamentally the question is where do you think it comes from, that fear? But then secondly, my assessment, which might be a little bit more controversial, I think more and more people, especially young people, are warming up to this, is more of a conspiratorial one. I do think that there was definitely a deliberate effort on behalf of these major intelligence agencies like the CIA, domestically at home, the FBI, to basically brainwash people and get them to change their minds, possibly
You
under
you
the threat
said
of violence.
brainwash was a very strong word beforehand.
Yeah, no, but I'm
No,
actually gonna
no,
just commit to it.
I
I
would
think it's
just
right.
like to
Yeah.
add to that,
And
like
under the threat of violence,
I would just
I
like
think
to
they're
add to
basically.
that. If we're asking Matthew a question regarding where do we think that this sentiment of like this Red Scare has come from, if he thinks based off of what he sees, like currently while campaigning, do you think, Matthew, that this sentiment has actually decreased among younger people? Do you think that my estimate is correct, where a lot of Generation Z isn't really like scared of the terrorists coming in and swooping the towers, or of the far left taking over the country? Do you think that those fears that used to like tremble people and get them out to vote have now reduced, and we're sort of starting now on a blank slate where younger people are much more concerned with things like gun violence or abortion rights?
I do. I do think that. I think really the answer to both of these and a lot of other political issues that are fading or changing the priorities of younger people is a loss of community. I think we are being turned against each other and isolated in a lot of ways, particularly during and after COVID. But due to the rise of online spaces, I think that is why a lot of younger people are just kind of feeling it as antsy or antagonistic. Maybe not because of terrorism concerns. I think, there's a lot more embrace of diversity among a younger group, even among Republicans, younger people. I mean, as anti-immigrant as they are, there's a type of diversity they do celebrate, as you're saying, of,
Yeah.
some of quote unquote the good ones, right? Like they can embrace a certain level of tolerance. And there's actually a good amount of people in both parties that support gay people, right? Not trans people,
Yeah.
unfortunately, but gay people are welcome in a lot of folds in a lot of different places. But I think the loss of community is really what led to a lot of the anti whatever you want to do because people just don't have as much togetherness as I think you would need to have real solidarity and support. What people do younger people care about the boogeyman of old? No, right? I mean, I think I mentioned China earlier as like kind of like that's the new, a relatively new attempt at like that's the new boogeyman now. It's like that China's beating us in this and China's stealing our data. And I mean,
Like
last
I just think
year
to myself,
when
I mean, why do we even
TikTokers,
care? And
yeah, they
why
tried to
does it
ban
even matter?
TikTok, and Trump was like, they're taking your data. We need to get everybody off TikTok, and we got to sell it to an American company. And what did young people do? They downloaded the Chinese app, Red Note, and they
Yeah.
willingly gave their data over to China as like a big
People do not
statement.
care. People do not care. I did that. I did that.
Yeah, people don't care
Dude,
because it's just
bro,
like
I'm
we've lost
honestly, I don't
so
know if I'm
much
allowed to
already.
say this, but I'm actually kind of pro-China nowadays.
A lot of people are. A lot of young people are pro-China
I
because
mean,
like
I have my
they don't
reasons, but
believe the propaganda
uh,
and they're like actively rebelling against the propaganda because I mean there's a whole thing you get into about what
yeah,
younger people and people in general's media literacy is like how are they interacting with what is coming out of mainstream media, and certainly a lot of people can't trust the federal government anymore for good reason. So people have to make their own decisions. And where does that lead people? A lot of times online podcasts or TikTok as a Google or Chat GPT, as like becoming a search engine for people, which is horrifying and really scary. But you
yeah,
can't
it's just not
convince people
happening.
that like mainstream media or the government is giving you the correct information these days, because a lot of times particularly from the government, they're not. And the mainstream media, it depends what you're looking for. By and large, I trust, a lot of our legacy media magazines and New York Times and all that, but you can't convince a lot of people that what they're saying is in their best interest or the slant that they necessarily are looking for. Because again, it goes back to the rise of partisanship. If people are looking to see evil being called out in one way or the other, and they see measured language from these corporate newspapers that are owned by billionaires and have their own agenda, it's like, the whole Palestine issue is really motivating for younger people because they're just not seeing
Definitely.
the truth told on that front. They're getting a lot of truth from TikTok or online sources, and they're also seeing horrifying images there. Like young children are being blown up on their feeds
Yeah.
and
And
horrifying
yeah,
violence is being told.
it's weird though.
I
even
think
even that
Twitter,
was,
I'll just
yeah,
quickly say, I think
yeah,
Twitter is like the worst perpetrator of all of this like cited,
Twitter is just
Yeah,
garbage.
misinformation.
Like,
Because every single time some big events happens, it's Twitter where people go to see big
yeah,
media figures, debate things
yeah,
and get
just
upset in the comments. And it's always just like the most extreme takes that get glorified on there. Like the two examples that I'm audibly thinking of is when the October 7th attack happened on Israel, and I think
yeah,
oh,
Jordan Peterson of all people commented, "Enough is enough. Go get them, Israel," or something like that. Bomb them all, and it
yeah,
was insane. But that got a lot of notoriety, and
no, I mean it's the
and
problem
then
is what I'd
when
say is,
Donald
yeah,
Trump,
go ahead, yeah,
Jordan, just a second, and
yeah,
then when
yeah, go
Donald
ahead, go
Trump
ahead, yeah.
won the election for the second time, the "Your body, my choice forever" tweet, like every single time something is just extreme, it gets pushed to the widest audience of people available because every
yeah.
single
Was
time
that
that
from
people
Nick
disagree
Fuentes?
with it, that just helps spread the statement.
That tweet was from Nick Fuentes, the second
Yeah,
one, right?
no,
Right.
Yeah,
I think so. I
I
don't
don't
know.
even know if he's, yeah, it's not that relevant, but yeah,
You
whatever.
you were saying earlier though.
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, okay, when it comes to the Peterson comment, I mean, to be honest, he's always been those have that's always been a pretty accurate representation of what he believes. So I actually don't think that it's
But
as out of the
regardless
blue as
of who
far-fetched
he is as a figure,
as
my argument is that that is
yeah.
simply the algorithm of Twitter that it perpetrates this sort of
Yeah, but
misinformation.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely right when it comes to saying that the algorithm promotes and heavily boosts those types of tweets, that type of content particularly. But to me, what's even more dangerous about all of this, what's more dangerous about Twitter more generally, how their algorithm works is they deliberately boost, well, perhaps not deliberately, it depends on how you interpret that, but they definitely boost one way or another, not just people's opinionated statements or pronouncements about the status, moral status of any given side in any given conflict, but actual pieces of misinformation as
Yeah.
Matthew stated, are almost deliberately deceiving people on a mass scale. Like, for instance, the claims about 40 beheaded babies, babies being burned alive that we saw floating around in the aftermath of the October 7th attack, they just have no basis in reality whatsoever. No
Weren't a
evidence.
lot of
Yeah,
the
no,
misinformation also attributed to like
yeah, there's
AI? People were using AI to create like
yeah, yeah, no,
Yeah,
just
AI
no evidence
bots.
to back up any of these claims about Israeli babies being beheaded or
Yeah.
burned alive, just pretty much coming out of nowhere. And
And
then
the
when they did
domestic
try to
stuff,
actually
they're
dig up,
eating the
yeah, when they
dogs.
yeah,
yes,
eating, yeah,
yeah.
and then even, yeah, and you have in America the Haitians eating dogs. And then when they tried to actually furnish the so-called evidence, you're right, a lot of it was just AI generated imagery, or not even AI generated imagery, but images that were taken from previous conflicts that have nothing to do with Israel Palestine, just misinformation. That's absolutely what Twitter promotes because it really feeds, I think, on people's short-term emotional volatility. And obviously, I don't completely discount emotions; they're very important. They play an important role in determining morality or moral criterion and considerations of the world. But when it comes to the actual facts at hand, which are just as important, if not more important, you really have to separate those very base and animalistic impulses from what's actually out there in the world. And I think that's where Twitter becomes really dangerous. I don't even use Twitter. And I tell people that you should probably shy away from Twitter. I just think it has a really damaging effect on your mental health, as trite as that might sound, let alone on the political sphere. But
It's true.
Matthew, go
Yeah.
ahead. I've been speaking for a
And that's what I
while.
was saying is like these
So,
online spaces really are deteriorating our brains and like making us trust each
yeah,
other less and trust other
yeah,
weird.
there's less
Like
trust,
that's what
definitely.
draws people to like these AI chat bots that like I mean a lot of people are becoming close friends or married to like these bots because it's just like they need some community somewhere and when they go online they get hate fear forced in their algorithm and they get angry and they see all this misinformation and it's like I just want to be with someone I can trust and someone who's listening to me. And it's hard to find that because, I mean, where are people supposed to go in real life to get that sort of stuff these days? There's places, right? I mean, there's clubs that are out there, you can, like communal sports teams or whatever, but like people don't have as much money or energy as they used to devote to those kind of activities. So they're going to do stuff online, they're going to do stuff on their phones, and they're going to go towards these dark corners of the internet. They're going to lead them to even darker places. And it's ruining a lot of young people's way that they see the world. And I mean, it's not unique to young people, right? I mean, Fox News has been doing this for decades with a lot of older folks that they also don't have a community and they also are very isolated and they're also seeking companionship or unity and wanting to become a part of something bigger. And that's where they get into that us versus them narrative of like, well, I'm not alone because I've got all my real American patriots with me from Fox or One American News. And, that's making me feel like I
From
am
Sandy.
part of something. And ultimately, they're just sitting there on the TV watching these people spew hate at them for hours on end, and then they're wondering why their grandkids don't call them anymore. It's really
Yeah.
sad what has happened to people, not just young people, but across the board.
No, completely agreed. It's definitely having a negative effect. Jonathan Haidt, he's a psychologist. He wrote a good book about this recently called The Anxious Generation. I think
Hmm.
he's actually a person I wanted to talk to, invite onto the podcast because he's a really smart guy. A very interesting choice of topics, but he actually communicates and echoes the exact types of themes and ideas that you're talking about, the exact type of critiques that social media has definitely yielded. And as trite as this sounds to some, because I think more and more people are probably becoming aware of this. It's not a mind-blowing insight, but it's still important. It's no less important as a result thereof. But social media definitely seems to be one of the major factors that is driving a general deterioration in basically the mental health and the happiness, really most fundamentally, of the population. And he actually backs it up with data showing that rates of diagnosed mental illness are going up, depression's going up, anxiety, suicidality. It's a really tragic phenomenon that should not be happening, especially not in a
Yeah.
country that's ostensibly as advanced and as supposedly developed as America is. But such
And
is
it's
just the
really
tragedy of the 21st century. So yeah,
And it's
go
really
ahead.
tricky if you're thinking like, how can we help people? Because ultimately that's what I'm trying to do, right? I'm running for office so
Yeah,
I can
trying to
help
help people.
people and, get into government and write laws that can tackle some of these problems. And we've seen really, frankly, poor attempts to try and regulate online, basically since YouTube and all those social media sites came of age in America. There has not been any real success in protecting young people. And most recently, we've gotten really sweeping bans of various online adult content that is
Yeah,
ultimately just
yeah.
forcing kids
Point.
out of spaces completely. And it's like, let's just get like a baseline safety of like, let's regulate first AI to make sure that they're not doing all the intellectual property theft that they do, right? That'll
Yeah.
remove a
Well, I
lot of
think
the
yeah.
familiarity with people, right? So like the character AI stuff, like they're not going to be able to talk to Gojo or SpongeBob or whatever if we can remove some of the intellectual property, and that'll help, right? And then we can make sure that we can do like the age verification stuff that's happening in the EU and that's happening here. Like I don't know where that's going in the future, but that's really troubling. That is like you have to provide your government ID to go online because you could see porn, right? Like we can't do stuff like that. But there has to be some sort of middle ground of like making more online spaces for kids is probably a priority, right? So they can not, so they're less likely to see porn and adult content on whatever the new age Club Penguin or Neopets is going to be for kids, right? We don't have those spaces anymore. They're on Roblox playing with all adults doing this dress for success stuff,
Yeah.
which is great and fun, but that's not a place for kids, right? Like, where does the
Yeah.
government get onto that? I don't know, but we need to look into helping people find spaces that they should be that are age appropriate, and that'll
Uh,
solve a lot of these problems.
Yeah, I was just about to mention the Roblox thing because that is a huge thing that I was thinking about
Yeah.
when you were saying it, how there's
The
no,
huge
places for children anymore. And I immediately started thinking like the new modern age Club Penguin would probably be Roblox, but there was this troubling statement recently from their CEO, which is Dave Baszucki, and it was this huge scandal that was related to it. I know this is sort of off topic, but it kind of rhymes in what you were saying
Yeah.
when you think of it, where the CEO himself has said that he's trying to go more into this like the whole thing that Meta under Zuckerberg was trying to do, where they're trying to make it like a VR space for people of all ages to meet, and they're gonna have like a social component, they're gonna have a voice chat, they're gonna have a way for people to like meet in real life, they're gonna have
dude.
like dating options and stuff, and he
Yeah.
forgets like he said this, you can look this
Yeah,
up.
he did.
And he forgets
Well,
that the original purpose of his company and of his website was mainly targeted towards kids. That's where the advertising went for a long time. And recently there was this whole scandal of predators being like arrested because they were trying to groom kids throughout that site.
Yeah.
And while that users were sort of trying to report that and bring the attention of that to the authorities, the company was like shutting them down and literally suing them like in court for alleging that their website had like this sort of like material. Just like slapstick lawsuits in order to silence them, which shows that a lot of these large corporations aren't truly intentioned on, making the discourse better and providing a safer space for children. They only do that because of regulations. Up until the point of
Yes.
regulations, it's actually quite more profitable to show 12 or 13-year-olds porn because God knows that once they're exposed to that, there's no going back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's horrifying.
yeah.
And it's not like this stuff can't be done, right? I mean, there was a culture of like protecting kids, like actually protecting kids, not the like hysterical protect the children stuff they're doing now, but
Yes.
like
Yeah.
I
Pizzagate.
I mean,
Shit,
if
yeah.
you regulate these companies, they will act And you can have like junior versions of sites or, ways that cater directly to kids without punishing everybody else. Because that's the argument right now. It's like if you're going to put these limits on these websites, everybody's going to be hurt because it's just going to regulate everybody. Well, if the websites aren't for everybody in the first place, then you're just not going to be affected. But we don't have that right now because of all the profits that are being generated instead. And that's an area that the government needs to step in on. But I don't know if it's because they don't understand online culture and what's happening online, and I think that's a large part of it, or they
Mhm.
just don't care because of the influence and the corporate donations that they're getting from Meta and these other companies that are telling them to look the other way. Somebody has to do something, that's
It's really hilarious to me that the people who were like shouting the satanic panic in the 80s and 90s and about how Pokemon cards are being used by like Satanists to groom your kids are the same people who most likely voted for the same guy as Elon Musk in 2024.
definitely,
Yeah.
definitely.
I just
Jordan.
want to make a brief comment, but every time I hear the words metaverse, my eyes just roll into the back of my skull, man. I cringe. I can't even
Yeah,
hear that term. Because when I look at what he's trying to do, okay, when it comes to, I think people have somewhat of a misconception as to what we actually believe here in sport movement. I don't want to say that our beliefs are completely homogeneous, but in the past we've done many podcasts, we've recorded many podcasts that focus on the theme of technology, but from more of a philosophical angle through which we actually try to dissect the concept and basically conduct a critique of technology. And some of our members are very deeply invested into those types of critiques. We have a guy named Pearson. I don't really want to say too much about him because he's not here. And it wouldn't really make much sense to do that, but he loves people like Jacques Ellul, Ted Kaczynski, not necessarily the actions, but the critiques that are in some of his writings. These types of thinkers, some of these anarcho-primitive thinkers. So many people like to paint with a broad brush and assume that we're just universally opposed to contemporary technology, modern technology, and that we're basically primitivists. I hear that term thrown around sometimes, anarcho-primitivism. Bit of a meme term on the internet, but it does have actually an actual historical basis. I would say
yeah,
that's not really the case. Obviously, I don't want to speak for Jacob, but if you think about technology as, and this is a theme that I think about all the time, philosophy of technology, these types of writers, some of the people who wrote about this, people like Heidegger, Jacques Ellul, and so on and so forth, if Oswald Spengler, many others. But if you think about what technology is, it doesn't necessarily have to be negative. I mean, even if you're the most conservative, traditional person,
yeah,
technology could still actually help you because if you look at the basic definition of technology, it's really just a compilation or collection of tools and devices and perhaps even ideas. They don't always have to be physical. I think most people associate them with the physical that we use in order to achieve a certain practical goal. And on its face, on paper, that's actually noble. I mean, I have nothing against technological innovations or progress on balance, or not necessarily on balance, but in their own right and with respect to the idea of technology. I'm actually for certain manifestations of technology as well as the idea itself. I think that, for instance, within the context of medicine, they have been pretty effective. I mean, people
yeah,
forget, but technology doesn't just refer to, and I see this all the time online. I really need to counter this type of discourse because I think it's a pretty destructive trend. Technology doesn't refer solely to these hyper digital little gadgets, the slick toys that we have nowadays, like these iPhones, iPads, I this, I that. Anesthesia itself is a technology, and it drastically augmented the quality of life for countless people. I mean, if we didn't have that, people would probably be dying because you can literally die of pain. People would be dying of pain during surgeries. I
The
mean,
nicest the nicest
mortality rates would
technology
go
to
up.
have
Yeah,
was
they're
would be to make Amtrak work again so that I could actually use it
yeah,
around
yeah,
that.
and it's just
yeah,
the funniest example to me is because I see people online who call themselves Luddites and anarcho-primitivists, and they're also musicians, and I think to myself, bro, you own a guitar. I mean, a guitar is literally a piece of technology.
Everything around us is a piece of
it's
technology. It
true.
Doesn't
just
just like
sucks
this.
when
So
stuff around us
this
is like
idea, that's
so
what,
unregulated
yeah.
where big technology companies can actually affect us in such a big way.
Yeah, but I think so. That's the problem. What people are really concerned with, and to bring up the guitar example, yeah, I mean, the guitar is a perfect example. It doesn't exist in nature. We had to create it in order to achieve a certain end. We rely on medicine, contemporary medicine all the time. So whenever I see these Kaczynskiites or self-described neo-Luddites on Twitter, because Twitter tends to attract love, they love Twitter, man. Twitter
Yeah,
attracts these types of faces like flies to feces, basically. I'm just confused, and I think to myself, I don't think that they understand the contents of their own beliefs and what it is that they're actually ranting about. And so I think the problem that we have nowadays isn't necessarily with technology itself. It's with certain manifestations of technology and where they're actually going. And so when it comes to the big tech magnates, these types of people like Elon Musk,
The
Mark
Zuckerberg.
Zuckerberg and so on, Bill Gates and so on and so forth. Well, first of all, it's interesting to me that they've acquired such tremendous quantities of wealth. I mean, we should
yeah,
probably think about that because I do still think I'm pretty old school in this sense. I do think that economic inequality is generally a problem, but not inherently a problem, so long as it doesn't mean that more people are suffering than is actually necessary, if it's necessary at all. But I still
It's
think that
usually a
it's
symptom of
practically.
something that
Yeah, yeah.
is
I think
more
it's
damaging.
more
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's more important so far as it's a symptom of a more fundamental problem, which is that, okay, if certain people are poor and if that's negatively impacting their life, which it pretty much always is, especially more extreme levels of poverty, while we still have the resources that we could actually use to pretty much wipe out that poverty, there's obviously a moral problem here. That's what it comes down to for me. I don't really think that it's inherently a problem. But with that being said, if you look at these types of billionaires, they almost universally acquired their wealth through these types of technological innovations. But I don't think that the specific innovations are all completely equal to each other in terms of content and kind. On the most fundamental level, they are because they all fall under that broad category of technology. But again, it's a very broad category. And I think that some factors are more pernicious than others. Some movements, some trends are more destructive than others. I think Zuckerberg is the perfect example. I'm very skeptical of Meta, of the idea of the metaverse, because what that looks like to me, and I'm not even some expert on this, I'm not some deep or researcher or scholar. What it looks like to me is basically trying to create an alternate reality or a hyper reality in which people can sink so as to avoid
It
responsibility.
feels like they're trying to escape
And
to.
that's what I don't, yeah, that's what
Sorry,
I
if
don't
I could
like.
just
Yeah,
sum up what I've sort of understood from
yeah,
your,
yeah,
just honestly, I understood bits of it, but it feels like a lot of what is being said points towards Mark Zuckerberg doing this thing where he sort of tries to escape to like this whole metaverse thing, where he tries
yeah,
to parallel a lot of these interactions that are being done on his platforms towards like this fictional reality. Whereas Elon Musk is doing a parallel thing where he's aiming towards, hey, let's do star exploration, let's all go to Mars, and ignoring the very real problems here on Earth that his money could potentially solve. And the
Yeah.
issue that I see with a lot of these like big billionaires, and this is not to
the
criticize the
tech
concept of the
magnates.
billionaire at its
Yeah,
root, because fundamentally, I believe that I'm sort of like in the center. It's towards the fact that a lot of the money that goes into politics and into lobbying could very well have gone into NGOs and stuff like that if these people actually care to make a difference. But rather than
Definitely.
that, it's very much about control. And if you eliminated like the people in the presidential race, let's say, or in the presidential primaries, who very much could, be put in a very unfortunate position if they've been elected. Let's say they have to sacrifice something of their own. Let's say they have to live like a monk. Let's say they could never own money again. There will be a
Yeah.
very small contingent of people who would actually go down that route. They want to go down that route because they believe it's prestigious, rather than because they think that they can affect real change. Matthew, I think we took up a lot of time just sort of
yeah.
talking about the different
Well,
concepts
look,
we talk about
Yeah.
here.
Well, there's a couple things
yeah,
I wanted to address from that
yeah,
last
go.
Of
I mean,
discussion
course,
it's more
there.
free flowing.
talk
Yeah.
Just
uninterrupted, man.
to preface this, I'll say I don't feel like it's always the case that we have to ask each other specific questions in order to generate a good conversation. Because I actually like
I
the
have
idea
I
of
have questions
yeah,
left. I have
I like
questions
yeah,
left though. I
I
want to get to
actually and
those,
I
please.
don't want to discomfort Matthew
S'il
here, but
vous plaît.
I do like the idea of riffing off of each other's ideas and
I like
points of
that too.
discussion.
Yeah.
But
Matthew,
yeah,
riff off of his
with that
ideas,
being said,
please.
yeah,
Yeah, no,
go
I really
riff
enjoy the
on
free
it.
flowing conversation. It's led to a lot of conversations that I haven't had yet in this conversation. So I'm very eager to talk about these sort of things because I mean, these are
Yeah,
real issues that a lot of people are concerned about as well. So no, I appreciate the venue here. I think
yeah,
related to the technology thing first, I agree. I'm not anti-technology either. I think what the problem is and what you're touching on here is like the way that technology is affecting our communities and kind of serving as an escape for a lot of things is the problem. Once again, it comes back to like we're losing our community. Technology is at its best when it brings us together, right? I mean, when we have, I mean, look at the Arab Spring, right? That was a whole
yeah,
revolution that would not have been able to happen because people are able to coordinate on Twitter and bring different parts of their ideas together to ultimately topple a restrictive government, right? Like that probably wouldn't have been able to happen without the connective power of technology. And a community was formed out of that that did some real good, right? When you people can come together, that's when technology is at its best. When we are being attacked and it's all predatory as the way it's been so far, that's awful. But as you said, there's many different forms of what technology is that a lot of people, if they're anti-technology, wouldn't necessarily think of like, well, this part of technology is bad. Like, I mean, again, to bring people together, translation technology is huge, right? I mean, the leaps and bounds that we've been able to make that like people can hold casual conversations in
yeah,
hundreds of languages across the world because they have something in their pocket that can translate better than any pocketbook can, right? Like that's huge for people. And there's always the concern of like, is technology forcing people out of their jobs? What's going to happen to, in this case,
Yeah,
translators or something? That's never going to replace, right? That's the goal of technology, and like as you said, in the medical field and all those places, it's not to force people out of their jobs. It's to
yeah,
supplement what they can already do and lead them to better longer term products that they'd be able to invest their time and energy in now. That's a lot of the more base level stuff can be handled by the robots and machines, like industrialization for the new era,
exactly.
right? Like the Industrial Revolution was huge because
Yeah,
now we don't have to spend all of our days sewing buttons onto clothes anymore, right? Like that can be taken by the robots. Same way of like every conversation in the world doesn't require a full-time translator, right? But they can still have
yeah,
work to be done to translating, localizing media or translating books, and go on and on. And then for the money thing that we are talking about, and just like how much is invested in all of these tech companies, and how that's affected our glut of billionaires now that we've generated in this world. That again goes
yeah,
back to like, as you said, the money in politics and where the priorities are of just like, if you really want to do good in the world, buying a politician is not the way to enact change. It's a lot of ways a way to keep the status quo in place that benefits you to allow that all that money to be gathered in the first place, right? Because you can stop something from happening by having the right votes in place very easily. It takes real work to make change and make things go forward. To do nothing, you don't have to do anything, right? You just need to make sure the right people are in place. How many races in the House or in the Senate are millions or hundreds of millions of dollars? Like every year, every election cycle we see, that's the most expensive race ever. And how much of that money could have been spent on something else that would have affected the community? Probably 99% of it, like beyond relatives, door to door approach, maybe a billboard, a TV ad, radio ad, like get the word out in every race, sure. But to the level that we've seen, the deluge of like rise of, the consulting industry and the online spaces, and it doesn't need to be this way, but it is, and it's really harmful for a lot of people. And then that does attract, as you say, the wrong type of person, because who are the politicians that are going to get involved? The people that can already have wealth and the people that can manipulate their wealth a lot easier. And that leads back to my race, the guy that I'm running against. As I said, he's got many different financial scandals. He's led the state in campaign sponsored travel for the last couple of years. He's going to fancy castles in Ireland on a campaign business. He's going to the Kentucky Derby on campaign business. He's going to Hawaii. Like, those aren't things that have anything to do with his job, but they got the money in place from these expensive millionaires donating to their campaigns. And real change, meanwhile, is not happening, but he's living high on the hog. And there's many stories like that across the world. And also locally in my district, that's like we need to toss these people out because we're never going to get better as a country, as a community, until we can actually look at what the community is really supposed to focus on, bring us together.
no, agreed, completely. When it comes to the point of automation, that's really interesting because that keeps appearing in these recent presidential debates. I mean, if you think about Generation Z, Zoomers more broadly, I think many of us received our first exposure, our first real taste of organized, systematic politics, at least in the sense of campaigning and electoral politics, with these two major elections, the 2016 election and the 2020 election, because many of us
Yeah.
were actually just too young to really embrace and to really appreciate the significance of 2012, another important election. So for us,
Hmm.
2016, 2020, those are the real watershed moments. Those are real turning points that actually activate our political awareness. And when it came to 2020, it seemed like a major theme, a recurring theme that was nonetheless disproportionately propagated and communicated by people like Andrew Yang. We talked about this a lot. And he even wrote a book
Yeah.
about this. I don't know if it's called the Fourth Industrial Revolution or if he coined that term or not, but that's really now his trademark term, his catchphrase. A key idea that we see in the 2020 election is that one of the major threats, not only to the prosperity of any particular industry, because obviously some industries are probably more likely to be affected by automation and by technological advancement than others, whereas others are more safe. I mean, I think industries that, for the most part, industries that require the presence and the consolidation of very specific tool sets, of very specific sets of knowledge, pretty safe. They can't really be replicated by any type of machine or AI. Those are going to be fine, but then there are others that, as you've hinted at earlier, are somewhat more manual in nature, a little bit more simplistic, a bit more repetitive, and that might actually put some people at grave risk when it comes to endangering their income. That's something that we probably have to worry about. But generally speaking, there's this idea that was propagated by people like Andrew Yang that automation is not just going to be a specific industry level threat, but a threat to the prosperity of the entirety of American society. And he thinks it's actually the major obstacle that we really need to be worried about, which is what motivated him in a sense to advocate so fervently for his policy of UBI, universal basic income. The idea is that
Right.
in order to really brace the impact of automation, if it hits us hard, we need to be prepared. And the best way to be prepared for that is for people to have that base level of income at which they can comfortably sit, such that they're not in danger of, for instance, succumbing to complete impoverishment in the case of job losses and these types of detrimental economic impacts. But what do you think about the extent to which that basic idea is even correct in the first place? That automation is actually this extremely destructive force. Because to me, from a historical standpoint, I mean, generally speaking, I tend to approach today's problems from the perspective of historical shifts and transitions. I always think about how a particular problem that we face right now in the present moment might have manifested itself differently in the past, so that such that I can trace a potential line of continuity from the past to the present. I think that's always a very valuable and liquid pursuit. And when I think about this, this is not really a new phenomenon. You mentioned industrialization. In the Industrial Revolution, we see a similar dynamic. You go back to really any period of mass scale technological and even scientific progress, and there's always concern about displacement, there's concern about tradition. I think that's one of the central themes, the central tensions of history, really, and definitely of intellectual, not really, actually not just of intellectual history, but probably more specifically of social history and economic history, and more practically speaking, because intellectual history is a bit lofty, is the tension between the idea of rationality and of the rational human who is not bound to any traditions or dogmas in particulars and has a much more laser focused understanding of what's good in life and how to get there, that they arrive at through rational understanding. Again, it's just a very enlightenment their idea, versus traditionalists who basically think that we almost have to adhere to certain doctrines because they're just not questionable. I mean, they've been like that for a while. If you have more of a Platonic bent, you could say that they're eternal. That's probably the major clash. And I'm not completely sure as to which side is really closer to the truth. I think it's a pretty good, difficult issue. And I definitely think that there are pros and cons to each of these major revolutions, you could say, in human society. So to me, the standard liberal idea, the Whiggish idea that if you trace the arc of history, it's just a straight line towards the future, which is progress. And we've talked about this a lot. I think that's a pretty flawed idea that needs to go. I think we tend to presuppose that that's just the nature of social reality as a society. Most people think that for the most part, society is improving over time. I mean, most people would think that we're better today than we were, say, 100 years ago, than we were 200 years ago. If you go back to 1900, I'm sure most people would think that they were more advanced than the people of 1700. That seems to be the general manner in which we actually conceive of the nature of history. I think that's flawed and that has to go. And there are definitely specific pros and cons of each of these major shifts. I think there are pros and cons of the Enlightenment, pros and cons of the Industrial Revolution. They're not universally positive. But as for whether or not this particular trend, this recent trend of a debate over automation, over technological advancement, and whether or not they really are the main dangers to human prosperity, the main threats to human prosperity, you could say, is well-founded, or if it's irrational based on irrational biases, what would you say about that issue? Because it seems as if this is becoming an increasingly political issue. I mean, Andrew Yang, for instance, and some of his followers have done a lot to raise this, to bring it to the forefront. And that actually induced even some of the people that you mentioned earlier, like Bernie Sanders, to talk about this. Now, Bernie thinks that we just need a stronger social safety net, but maybe it's more fundamental than that. I know it's very broad, but if you had to riff on that idea of the threat of technology, what would you say about that? And its role in politics, you could say.
Yeah. Again, lots to unpack there. I love it.
Yeah,
I
there's a
think
lot. I
the
know
first
it's
thing I want to
very
address, I
long-winded.
think the long arc of like things are getting better over time.
Yeah, definitely
I
phenomenon
do think is
part.
probably genuinely true. I think,
Okay.
I mean, certainly on a civil rights angle alone, it's just, yeah, we're probably better off than we were 100 years ago. But I respect that, with the automation portion and like the work-life balance and all that, that's where we can kind of get into, are we better off? But uh and I would, right? So to zoom in a lot on this, let's talk
Yeah,
about
let's jump.
automation and
Yeah.
this partnership with government that we need to have. So I'm a teacher. I'm a substitute teacher right now. I was a full-time teacher last year. As I'm running the campaign, I needed to be more flexible with my schedule, so now I'm a substitute teacher. But I've been in the classroom for a couple of years, and there's a large discussion among teachers and labor movements related to the teachers and other people that I've talked to, where they're very concerned about automation taking the job of educators and education related positions, or to speak about something that I know. I think that where you get into trouble with like the danger of automation and like real workers being replaced with robots in a harmful way is when you start sacrificing quality for profit. Just in general, I think that's where we need to be careful. There are things that, again, are on a more base kind of repetitive level that can and should be replaced by AI, like, or, or AI or robots or whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah, because not
Right.
all robots are necessarily AI, but
Yeah,
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 yeah, yeah.
right. But just speaking
Machines,
in
you could
broad
say
terms
machines.
here,
Yeah, yeah,
that more deeper educational back and forth, the actual education and tutoring and in-person contact and emotional connection cannot be replaced, right? So there's a lot of districts out there that are very excited that, especially with like kids that are in homeschooling situations that are more isolated or, online classes, that's like we can get these videos up there and that can replace teachers. Like we could take a long-term view of like we just don't need people in the classroom anymore. That's incredibly harmful and not going to serve the kids or serve the schools any in any positive way. There are things that can be replaced by automation, right? Like some grading aspects of like math problems or something, right? That'll save teachers a lot of time if you can cut back on the time that they spend grading homework or making tests, right? And then they just, do a review before they actually hand it to the kids. That stuff can be fine, easily replaced if in partnership with the affected workers, the teachers in this case, right? But if you're going to sacrifice the quality of the education, so now there's not going to be anybody that the kid can talk to, or the kids are going to be isolated from each other. We saw how harmful that was during COVID when kids physically could not be in the same space as each other. It's a different type of education that works for some, doesn't work for a lot, and a lot of education was lost because there's social skills that are no longer being developed. There's emotional, behavioral stuff that just is lost and is never going to get back for a whole generation of kids, right? That's going to get way worse if we're just going to replace our educators with robots. There's a number of industries you could make the same argument for, but ultimately, again, it just comes back to like, if we're sacrificing quality for profit, we're never going to benefit. But if we can work in partnership with those affected, we can make some improvements there. And that's where the government needs to step in and have a better relation with labor than, I mean, they've had in the past on this sort of stuff. Various industries have been crying out for help when it comes to like this automation is starting to cost us stuff because people aren't thinking of the long-term effects. We see in Hollywood, I've never worked in Hollywood, but we read the news. They're replacing writers for shows and movies and scripts with AI, right? That's not going to lead to any better. That's just going to recycle stuff that's
that's
already out there. That's not going to generate any new ideas. That's bad. That's clearly sacrificing quality for profit. Can they help, you know, visual effects artists like link different dots to other dots? And that would be super time consuming. Yeah, AI can do that, but like they can't replace the creative stuff. So to make it a whole thing of like zooming back out, right? What is the role
yeah,
of
macro scale.
automation in our politics? We need to look at that very seriously as like, yes, that can be a threat. And yes, it is a threat if we are driven by the wrong thing. It should be a partnership, but it's very rare that we get that.
That makes sense. So you don't think it's necessarily a major threat? That the
I think it can
pessimistic
be.
it can be, but not inherently so, perhaps. Or so
Right. Not
what
inherently.
do you
Yeah.
think that what do you think of the because there's this idea of techno-optimism, that term gets thrown around a lot. What do you think of its inverse techno-pessimism, that we should just have this natural aversion to technological progress? Do you think that's mostly unfounded or
That one's tricky because I think, again, if I'm just speaking about what I know as a teacher, what I'm drawn
yeah,
to and like what I like to do with the kids, uh, I am a little tech averse when it comes to like, oh, everyone's on their laptops. We're doing a lot of like Google stuff. I don't know if a lot of that is as valuable as it was when I was a student. I don't know how much of that is my nostalgia and that like it's more valuable to do writing or be more reliant on like your own research as opposed to that. Like there's a million arguments I can make on that. Um, but I have to admit, it's great that everyone does have those resources at their fingertips and that research can be less time consuming than it was before, or that they can, make a Google slide right there, and we don't have to go to a computer lab and do all that stuff. Like, to kind of again zoom out now, when it comes to my feelings on technology, I'm not tech averse. I'm not pessimistic about our integration with tech. It just has to be purposeful. We can't just do it to do it. I think that's a lot of people are very like, shiny new thing. That's great. Like, let's
Yeah.
go into it guns blazing and figure out if it's good or bad later. Let's figure out the consequences after. That's probably the wrong approach, but that's almost always the approach that we see, again, particularly with education. There's so many trainings and so many meetings like every year. It's like, we got this new technology and we're going to integrate it immediately. We haven't run any tests on it. You are all of the guinea pigs. And it's like, that's probably not the best practice, but it's the one we do time and time again. And that can be
That makes a lot
harmful
of
and
sense.
lead to resentment against technology, but done purposefully, I think that's where we can make success.
Yeah. To harken back to a point that I made earlier, also, which relates to questions of economics, wealth inequality, these types of more overtly political concerns. What do you think of the fact that such a significant and outsized proportion of the world's wealth today in the 21st century seems to be in the hands of people who we would generally describe as tech magnates, people who have made their fortune off of these technological innovations and from owning companies that are involved in that space? Because what to me is interesting about that, insofar as it relates to political spheres, those types of people, those figures, seem to be exerting increasingly significant and large uh, portions or units of influence on the political process. That's where I think there seems to be somewhat of a change. Now, some would say that it's perhaps not as dramatic of a change as it may initially appear to be, because even if you go back to the 19th century, which is an era I actually think about a lot, I think in many ways history operates on the basis of cycles, this idea of cyclical history. And I think that our century is no exception. This recent epoch is no exception to the rule. If you look at the 21st century, I think it's actually in many ways a repeat of some of the trends in the 19th. And so I've been thinking about the 19th a lot, studying it more closely, diving into some of the facts that I've already taken in previously just to see if I really remember them, recall them correctly. And the parallels are pretty uncanny when you think about it. You had the Gilded Age, and what was particularly interesting about that period was that these industrialists and these tycoons, these business tycoons, were pretty much taking over the government and really dramatically shifting the orientation and the direction of politics, political discourse, and of policy, public policy more broadly. And it seems as if that's almost repeating nowadays, except the exact manifestations of these technologies are a little bit different because of changes over time. So now, for instance, people like Elon Musk are more influential, whereas in the past it might have been someone like Carnegie, Rockefeller, DuPont, the more classic oil magnates, oil tycoons. Obviously, oil, natural gas, still very lucrative industries, and those families, the families that they left behind, are still extremely influential nowadays. But the basic pattern, I think, is essentially the same. And obviously, in the past, not many people, other than the billionaires and the magnates themselves and their support and their families, their patrons, were happy about that. I mean, I think most people are pretty much outraged by that. And that fueled this increasingly radical labor movement in the United States, which is a rarity because far left politics and economic domain wasn't a particularly prevalent force in the United States for a long time. It was probably somewhat taboo, with certain exceptions here and there. But that was actually what almost directly fomented, if you recall your history, American history, the rise of the labor movement in the United States, of
Yeah.
the socialist movement, the anarchist movement, and the violence that came with that. And it seems as if history is almost repeating itself nowadays because people, especially on the left, are increasing, but not just on the left, are increasingly angered by the fact that not only that inequality is ballooning, that it's skyrocketing to such absurd levels, but also by the fact that that upper portion of wealth, the 1%, you could say, that people like Bernie Sanders also speak about, seems to be increasingly nested in somewhat narrow domains of activity. And people don't necessarily know what to make of that type of relationship and how it might affect our lives. Because after all, if the entire political process, and this goes back to the broader theme about money politics, is basically, and really society itself and its direction, the direction which it goes is dictated by elite interests. Well, how do we have a democracy? In what sense can we say that people have any degree of control over their own lives? I think that's the fundamental tension at play here. And I was wondering as to whether or not you think that this is actually as big of a problem as some people think that it is. The fact that, first of all, wealth inequality is rising dramatically. I mean, it's just a fact. You can look at the data. And at the type of wealth, well, the sources of that wealth and of that explosion of wealth inequality seem to be pretty specific. They're nested in a couple of industries, and certain individuals are heavily involved and implicated. People like Elon Musk, for instance, these types of the new tech tycoons, you could say. And I was wondering what you think about these types of phenomena, whether or not this is negative, whether or not you have
Yeah,
more ambivalent views about it. Obviously, it's a broad topic, but feel free to go ahead because it's important, I think, very important.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I do think that it's incredibly harmful that this is where our politics are at. And I agree that it is a, a repeating pattern that we've seen in our American history. I think anytime you get a small group of people that are able to influence our government and kind of push their will out, that's not representative of the larger community, just by the very nature of what it is, right? Because the kind of people that are in there, let's just talk about this. The people that
Yeah,
are tech magnates and the people that are in those rooms and have those contributions to these campaigns, they see the world a certain way because of the way that they've lived their lives. The world that they interact with is completely different than ours. That's true whether they're oil people. That's true whether they're, railroad tycoons. That's true whether they're tech
yeah, yeah.
magnates. The
Anything.
way they interact with the world is so different than the way the average person is going to see the world. So when they're advocating for their needs to their members of government, it's not in line with anything that the average person probably would say is a concern of theirs. So if your government is responding to those concerns, it's kind of a binary thing. You're either responding to everyone who sees the world this way or everyone who sees the world the other way. And you're going to tackle problems based on the solutions that you think would help one community that you were talking to the most, which is those incredibly wealthy individuals. And in this case now, tech moguls. And how is that manifested in our politics? What are their concerns? What are we seeing play out as a result of that? Well, I mean, it's all the issues that we've been talking about in like a lack of regulation in the tech industry that people would have been crying out for and have been crying out for decades, and that our spaces are getting worse. Our spaces are deteriorating. It's affecting all of our mental health. This is the problem that if we're looking at anything online, this is what the average person would say, help us with this, government. But then the people they're talking to on this have completely different priorities. Like, actually, I'm not able to do my mergers. I'm not able to put out all of these things because there's all this red tape that could be there.
Yeah,
Let's make it easier to have any information of any sort disseminate because I want my post numbers to be higher. And I don't care if the users are human or AI. I just want more people to have more eyes on this. Like, the government is responding to their community when they're making all of these laws and they're doing this oversight or lack of oversight. And that's certainly the same sort of problems that led to the rise of the labor movement because we were fed up with the lack of solutions that were representing us. And it's like, well, if the government's not going to step in and protect our workers, then the workers are going to have to protect themselves. We're not seeing a lot of that movement right now, unfortunately. Again, it goes back to the lack of community and togetherness and the us versus them, that the 1% or the elites are purposefully integrating into our society by tearing us apart. When we're united, we can create great things and make these, steps forward for our own benefit. But if we're not, we've seen what's happened in the Trump presidency and various Republican administrations and Republican laws and Democratic laws as well, right? It's both parties that are representing these other people that don't see the world the same way as us. It's a huge problem. And then we get the rising income inequality as well, because I mean it's a whole domino effect that you already know, but that's my answer on that.
definitely, definitely. And as for the influence of particular individuals, people like Elon Musk, do you think that that is disproportionately negative, perhaps more specifically than that?
Yeah, I mean, look at the way that he sees the world and then try and put that
Yeah,
out into the mapping of what solutions get implemented. This is a guy that, I mean, he comes from South Africa. He comes from a place that did horrible racial violence against the natives, and he generated his wealth, his familiar wealth, from benefiting from that system.
definitely.
I'd be hard pressed to see a guy like that coming out of that system and then trying to implement his own worldview onto America and that leading to any sort of success for the broad, diverse citizenry that we have cultivated in our melting pot of a nation. It's just not going to happen. It's not going to work. He's not looking out for everybody. And I mean, we've seen that in the way that he's donated exclusively to Trump, somebody who views the world the same way that he does, and is willing to, you know, whether the conspiracies are to be believed or not, cheat the election machines or, certainly mislead people with election lotteries. Or, I mean, he knows a lot of the stuff he's pushing isn't popular, and he knows that he's going to have to force a lot of the stuff through because of cuts to various government social services that people love or US aid abroad, stuff that like people aren't able to fight for if they're not in the room. But once it's gone, it's going to be hard to get back. Like he's a wrecking ball to a lot of these things because like it's hard to rebuild when something's completely torn down unless you're already there and funding the construction company, right? To really make it a whole metaphor here. So no, yeah, Elon Musk is incredibly dangerous.
Definitely. When it comes to Elon Musk, it's okay. Obviously, on the one end, you have this more broad and abstract fact, which is more generally applicable. Perhaps some people would dispute its status as a fact. I'm just going to use that for the sake of convenience here. That he and what he's currently doing right now when it comes to the US government and the direction of policy is probably emblematic and representative of a much broader issue that pertains again to money in politics, to campaign finance policy, to the unjust and undue influence of corporate elite interests whose interests are not necessarily aligned with, or corporate and elite players, I should say, whose interests are not aligned with those of the public, those of the majority of the population, the majority that should really be represented most significantly by any type of democratic government. That's a major problem, major contradiction. But on the other hand, when it comes to the specifics, I would actually say that many of his technologies his specific technologies and proposed technological contributions are incredibly overhyped, if not to the point that they actually verge on basically being scams. Now that's somewhat of a different type of issue, requires a different set of knowledge to actually tackle, but perhaps we could return to that later because knowing what I know about the world and about different domains of knowledge, I actually do think that some of these proposals are either incredibly unrealistic or based on ground level fundamental assumptions that don't really hold up. And I think that is particularly that latter aspect, that latter weakness or source thereof, is particularly important when it comes to the brain-computer interface, which to me has always been the most significant, not perhaps necessarily the most significant, but one of the most intriguing and important innovations that he's ever proposed because it so directly relates to the medical field. And I've a
Yeah.
pretty strong interest in medicine. I've had a strong interest in medicine for a long, long time, and humanitarianism more broadly, and the idea of alleviating human suffering. I think that's really one of the highest ends towards which we can orient ourselves in life. And it at least claims or purports to be directly relevant to that. With that being said, I actually don't think that it's going to be effective, possibly at all. And I think there's a certain reason as to why this is the case. But before I expand on that, because again, it requires somewhat of a different scope or domain of knowledge, I'll just allow Jacob to jump back in because I can
It is an
sense
extremely dangerous game that Elon Musk is playing regarding
and
messing with technology and politics at the same time. But
yeah,
if you wanted me to have additional thoughts on that, I have none. I was just sort of thinking and riffing on the discussion that you guys have. I do have some additional questions for Matthew though, but
yeah.
it depends whether you're done with the points that you're trying to make, Jordan.
I mean, I'm basically done with the major points about technology, these types of issues. I did, but I just wanted to circle back to a more general point I think that we were raising earlier, and which ties to one of the fundamental themes of this podcast, which is so we were talking about where it centers on the contradiction that appears to arise whenever we think about how we have this American population who would benefit from certain policies, especially these economic policies,
Mhm.
that nonetheless seem to be almost to be basically
Taboo, yes.
refrained, shied away from, and actually blocked, negated, pretty much canceled out beforehand by the actual politicians themselves. And that seems to contradict both the theory and actual practice of democracy. And with that in mind, we were trying to come up with reasons as to why that might be the case. But I was wondering, and Matthew, you pointed out quite accurately, I think, that a lack of community seems to play a pretty prominent role in actually fomenting and in boosting and consolidating this disparity. But do you think there's a case to be made that perhaps there's more of an intentional effort as well? That there are more conspiratorial phenomena at play, whereby the government or maybe even certain corporate interests that are in collusion with the government right now, because it's a major problem, might actually be intentionally deceiving the population or trying to steer them away from their best interests. Because I think there is historical evidence to suggest that that has actually been the modus operandi of these major intelligence agencies like the CIA for a long time. And I was wondering as to whether or not you have any thoughts on on whether that might actually be a major problem as well.
Well, yeah, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, in that who is being represented is ultimately like where these questions go. Are we being steered a certain way so we can be more amenable to certain changes as they come through? Certainly, I think so. I think things are being proposed now that if they were proposed 10 years ago would have been completely beyond the pale and would have had people, up in arms, maybe not literally, maybe literally, regarding all sorts of, racial politics, all sort of economic politics. We're being primed for things to be a lot worse for a lot more people because there's been a slow decline and the kind of lack of appropriate coverage that we've been getting regarding that, I think is a sort of propaganda that I think is also being put forward by the government. And certainly, again, you look at our mainstream media, right? I'm not, again, I'm not one of those people that say don't trust the mainstream media, but writ large, I think, make your own opinions, read your articles, and then kind of do your own research. But again, it comes down to who's controlling these sort of narratives in the first place. A lot of times it comes back to, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, right? And, we could talk about Elon Musk all day and all his tentacles that he's got everywhere. I wouldn't be surprised if there's an actual concerned effort by the government to affect our narratives that we are encountered with every day. That wouldn't surprise me at all. To briefly put a button in the Elon Musk stuff and his priorities and how that's affected us, I think it goes back to one of the connections you made earlier, SpaceX. We've talked about how the metaverse is about like an escapism in our world, right? To
Yeah,
kind of
certainly.
get people a false community that is not real. And then Elon Musk is saying, like, we can colonize Mars and we can go out and explore the stars and we'll find a better escapism out in some other planet. So don't care about what's happening here. Both of those ideas are incredibly harmful to the people that are not able to do those sort of things and would not have any interest in going to Mars or devoting their lives to the online space completely. But it would be incredibly profitable for Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg if we did buy into those sort of things. So it's hyped up as like, look at this amazing SpaceX launch. We're going to go all these places and people can go into space. Look, Katy Perry is out here on Horizon Blue on Jeff Bezos's spaceship. That space tourism is a thing that can really happen in your life. It's like the Jetsons. And then you look at what in prior age, what space exploration was when NASA was properly funded. It wasn't really about leaving Earth. It was about enriching our lives through what we can find
Yeah.
out elsewhere. Maybe we'll search for like materials that are out on other planets or learning more about the origin of life because we can see that, there's some water molecules on Mars, or we go to the
Yeah,
outer
maybe you
reaches
can
and see,
detect extraterrestrial life or yeah,
yeah, we
that
can
that
search for extraterrestrial life. Like there's things that we can find that can enrich us in our own way of life, as opposed to completely changing or abandoning what we have now because we've run out of resources or we have too many people on the planet we need to leave, which is all a bunch of bunk, right? Like that's not the
yeah,
lives
yeah,
that
no
we
one
lead, and that's not
yeah.
really any solution that's going to help us now or in the future. But they need us to believe that it is. So I would not be surprised that certain stuff is being pushed to make certain things more amenable at all. But yeah,
Yeah, well, when it comes
let's
to SpaceX, yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. It just came to mind. I'm more familiar with Neuralink and that side of his work because it's always been a little bit more interesting to me, and I think it's pretty directly flawed in a way that many people don't realize or aren't aware of. When it comes to SpaceX, I've long been under the impression that a significant reason as to why he's saying that we should go to Mars or we should actually devote so much time and energy to that project in particular is because he views that he conceives of that as being almost a ditch defense or bulwark against the threat of climate change. Isn't that what he's actually
yeah,
said in the past?
that's
I
what he
believe that's what he
said.
said.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just in the worst case scenario that which seems to be increasingly likely because climate change is not going away. I mean, it's definitely real and it actually seems to be worsening. I think it's part of a broader ecological problem. That might be a topic for another podcast because it's just it's so comprehensive and huge in scope. But the statement here is that okay, if climate change continues and if the trajectory actually worsens, which it probably will based on the forecast, the Earth itself might actually become uninhabitable for most forms of life, including humans, because we're obviously a form of life, such that according to Elon Musk, we'd have to think of different alternatives, a planet B, basically, to in comparison to our planet A, which would be Earth, obviously, our home
Yeah.
planet. And so he thinks that by going to Mars and by exploring space, we can actually escape the dangers of climate change, escape these types of apocalyptic scenarios. But to me, that's always been a strange way to think about these types of problems because if it's such a problem concern, why wouldn't you just focus on mitigating it right now so that it doesn't actually
Exactly.
destroy life, basically? And so it doesn't force us to undergo this massive shift, this upheaval that many people aren't going to be comfortable with in the first place. And obviously, you could credit him for instance, Tesla, which at least shows that he is conscious of this problem and he's trying to combat it. but I think there's definitely a problem here when it comes to emphasis, a disproportionate emphasis on issues that might actually be distracting us from what's more important and what's more concrete in terms of what affects people in everyday life, basically. And that's
Yeah,
what I'd say about
definitely.
Monk. I do think that on balance, so he has been somewhat of a pernicious influence, to be honest. I mean, I would say that.
Yeah, and let's take the really long-term view here. Let's assume we do
Yeah, no,
colonize Mars, right? And like we
yeah,
go out there, we abandon Earth completely, or we have a new
yeah,
planet.
which is pretty.
If we don't change our ways or we don't solution like a way out of climate change, it will just happen again on now Mars. And it's like we'll have to be, the Elon Musk of the year 4000 will have to say like we need to go to Jupiter because that's the only place that we can escape the harmful effects of climate change on Mars is like, it's ridiculous and silly to take that long-term view,
Yeah,
but like
yeah,
it's a silly proposition because it's like this is never going to change who we are. We need to focus on not the symptom, of like escaping the harms of climate change. Let's fix climate change. I agree completely. He hasn't gone far enough on a lot of things. Yes, it's good that we have electric cars now. That's not going to be the thing that changes our planet. That's not going to get us to the end of the road. I mean, we need to, I mean, realistically, right? Like on a personal level, consumption and what our impact on the environment is outnumbered to the millionth degree, right, of these large corporations that are putting all these pollutants into the air unregulated and, offset by carbon emission purchases that they've made. And there's more we can be doing to make sure that our air and our water and all that stuff is not polluted beyond shaming people for not composting or shaming people for not driving electric cars. Even if everybody shifted to an electric car in the world today, it's not going to make a big enough dent in the damage that's already been done and the damage that will be done in the future. That's like if Elon Musk was serious about this stuff, it would not look like the things he's doing right now. But yeah, I know we have things we probably want to address. We'll wrap this up with the Jacob's questions or wherever we want to go
yeah.
here.
Good. Let's go to Jacob's question. No, but that was a perfect response. I completely agree with you about that. At the end of the day, you have distractions and red herrings and the issues that are more concrete. And I think we shouldn't conflate the two, obviously. But yeah, Jacob, go ahead. You had some questions that you
Thank
had
you
written.
for the rhetorics. So
Yeah.
there's a couple more things that I did want to ask Matthew while he had the time courteously to stay on our podcast and answer pretty much all of our inquiries, which we're very thankful for. So for the visit, just as a little flashback to what we were talking about earlier. So regarding like the influence of corporate lobbyists that we're talking about and their huge influence in legislation, and this obviously ties back to the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Elon Musks of the world, but also ties back to the current political landscape as we see it in California.
Yeah.
Matthew, what steps will you actually take to reduce the impact of those corporate lobbyists if you were elected to the State Assembly of California?
Well, on a personal level, the easiest thing you can do is just not meet with them, right? Just give them the access in the first place. They're going to, this is a bit of a sidetrack, but I promise it loops back to the question here. There's a whole industry of lobbyists and corporations writing bills for legislators, and they'll just leave them on their desk, right? Or email them or whatever they do these days and say, like, this is a bill that we would like you to propose. And then either sight unseen or very little oversight, the legislator's like, yeah, sure, this seems like something I can do. And then they'll just propose it, right? So lobbying and what lobbying is, I think is a lot more invasive or pervasive than a lot of people even realize. It's not just having conversations and going out to lunches and going on these fancy trips. It's literally, we have given you the bill that we want you to submit that you were never even thinking of, but we're going to make it incredibly easy for you to make this slight change in the law in a niche area of our industry that nobody knows anything about unless they have been talking to people in the industry, which we will happily provide to give you all of the references and facts that can convince you that this bill is actually better for their, whatever they're talking about, the newspaper industry or the nurses or, whatever, right? So
Hmm.
the best thing you can do on a personal level of a politician is just don't give them the access. Don't let them convince you of something that is not a real community concern that they can tell you is or is not. Talk to the people in your community first and foremost and tune out the people that pay millions of dollars to get the access to you that other people wouldn't have. That's the first thing you can do. But I'm just one legislator. If I'm elected, right? There's hundreds of others that are in the California legislature that will meet with lobbyists, and one person cannot make the complete change on their own on this. So there needs to be legislation in place. Ultimately,
Hmm.
we need to restrict access And we need to be more stringent that like if you're actually going to propose a law, it needs to be something that you've actually written or someone on your staff has written. It can't be from some outside source. There's, I don't know how we verify that sort of stuff, but there needs to be an effort to kind of crack down on that sort of outside direct influence. I don't know what that looks like. I'm not a lawyer, right? I think I'm very much a strong proponent of like we need diversity in the legislature. It can't be all lawyers and, people that have been small business owners or small business owners. Like I said, I'm a teacher and I'm an organizer, and my worldview and my values are just as important as people that have legal training. And ultimately, while we all are legislators and our job is to write and pass laws, there's a lot more that goes into the job than that too. And we need to rely on our own strengths more. That we need to give ourselves a more credit as legislators, not just force everything off on somebody else. 'Cause so that's what I would look into if I'm elected. Once I can talk to the people that are more familiar with the law writing process and how we can curb that sort of stuff, I would love to get the specifics on how we can do that because I
Yeah.
know it can be done.
And then
Sure,
when it comes
of
to this,
course.
I have two related.
Sorry,
I have two
I
related issues that punch out from
sure,
your
but
question.
I still have a lot of questions left. But
Yeah,
sure,
no,
go
but I
ahead.
think because they're directly related to the first one, so I wanted to do it while it's still relevant and fresh. But when it comes to that, Matthew, are there any specific policies that you'd be interested in trying to implement or pass that you think could effectuate that change? And two, do you think that any politicians of in recent memory, any contemporary politicians have actually gone far enough when it comes to trying to curb the influence of lobbying of corporate money in politics more broadly? An example that comes to mind here that might be particularly prominent and which could be good for you to comment on actually would be Bernie Sanders with his attempts to outlaw private campaign financing and actually make a complete switch and transition to totally publicly financed election. What do you think about those two questions or inquiries in particular?
I love public campaign financing. I think it's a great system. I worked on a campaign. I was manager for a city council candidate in Seattle where they have public campaigning. And what that system allowed is taxpayer dollars are put into a fund, right? That every qualifying candidate can have access to once they get a certain amount of petition signatures, right? Every citizen has a certain amount of dollars that they can give away for free from their tax dollars to a political candidate of their choosing that would represent them. And what that allowed the candidate that I was working with to do, who was an actor and activist, so not somebody with a lot of money, so they were able to get up to $100,000 in their campaign account just by going out in the community and talking to people and getting signatures and people buying in right there. I think it's a great system. Not every place is Seattle, not everything can do exactly that system, but that's something I would really like to look into is public campaign financing. I think that would eliminate a lot of problems of just when you look at campaigns and where candidates spend their time, like 80, 75% of the time is with donors or potential donors. And that often continues when people are elected. I forget the name of this documentary, but there's a great documentary that like basically followed like a day in the life of a congressperson in DC. And they would be like pulled from committee meetings because it's like, you need to make calls right now. Like we have fundraising obligations that if you don't meet, they're going to turn on you. And it doesn't matter how many laws you've passed or what votes you've done or what speeches you've given in the Congress. If you're not raising money for yourself and for the party at these hours, at this time, you're not a good soldier. And we're not going to continue to work with you anymore. Like it's very pervasive, not just in the campaign, but some of truly the campaign never ends because you're raising money for yourself, your party members, your future people. Like we can't be judged by that as legislators, as whether we're successful or not. That should be a completely removed from what we do, and it's incredibly close to what we do. So I hate that, and I would love to change it. And I agree, public campaign financing would be a great step forward.
Perfect. Jacob, and go ahead.
Sure. So another question that I actually had was you were talking a lot about, money out of politics and how these big corporate influences actually, address politics on a very broad level and how the most respectable thing that you can do if you don't want to participate in that system as a politician is to simply not take money out of those people. But we also talked a bit about recently how there's a lot of tension within the Democratic Party and politics in general, where if you're not a good soldier for the party, as you said, if you're not actually helping win votes and win elections, then in that very, bureaucratic sense, you're not seen as a valuable player. Because you are put in the very challenging position of challenging big money interests without taking money from big money interests. It's not like you're pitting companies against each other and saying, we'll get these guys out of power and then I'll take your money instead. You're very much trying to challenge the system and go outside of it. So in that position, not only are you running against someone that is currently like the minority leader in the California State Assembly, you're also running against the entire proposition that American politics is basically based upon.
Yeah.
It's very thankful that you're not a third party candidate, or else you'd have all the free strikes out.
Yeah.
You're still in a good position now, but you've hit two of the free strikes. So in that very challenging situation, what have been sort of like your plans? I know that there's a lot of like social media outreach and all of that, but how do you build momentum to actually keep money out of politics? What role do the like small dollar donations play? The community fundraising that you were talking about, going to different boards and unions, trying to sort of combat the impact of corporate lobbyists on legislation. There's a lot of like different interplay here, and what could policies or practices do you think are the biggest sell for you?
I'm not gonna lie to you, it's a very hard sell, this
Yeah.
candidacy as it exists right now. I don't think anyone's surprised to hear that. I have generated really no media interest or attention. As I said, it's very hard to prove viability in this race, even
Hmm.
though I am the only Democrat in the race running against a Republican. And for those who are unaware, the California system is a top two primary system. So the top two vote getters, regardless of party, are who move on to the November general election. There are only two candidates in this race. So unless that changes and somebody else jumps in, which is very unlikely to happen given the history of this district and the lack of competitiveness that we have seen, it's very likely I will be in the general election and I will be the Democratic nominee for District 9 Assembly.
Hmm.
That should be viability enough, right? Because we need to challenge every race that we can. We've seen, you know, historic changes in like when there are scandals or when there are things that really activate people's interest, partisan affiliations can change. It was 2018 or 2019 when there was that Alabama Senate race where the Democrat won because the Republican was involved in, you know, pedophilia charges, right? Like you have to
And
contest
even
all
a
those
lot of
races because you never know what's going
sure.
to happen, right?
Sure, and I want to just relate to that very quickly. Even outside of that, people are a lot more fluid than others think, because I have friends whose like parents would vote for Obama in 2008, Mitt Romney for in 2016. Then they would support Bernie Sanders in the 2016 primary, but since Bernie Sanders didn't get in, they would vote Trump. And then they voted
Yeah.
for Biden in 2020. It's just like you're going all over the place.
Yeah, a lot of people, when you actually look at their political beliefs, it's very hard to categorize them as like they're in the Democratic Party line or the Republican Party line or even the third party line. Like people agree with a majority of party positions on one of the major parties in the United States and they kind of just run with it. But if they see something more appealing, then they'll run with that.
Hmm.
Some people are like dyed in the wool. They will stick with their party no matter what. There are a good amount of people that also do that. So those people are unapproachable in politics and they're going to make their own minds up based on just whoever has the D or the R next to their name. And you're never going to be able to convince those people. It is
Yep.
what it is. Most voters are not like that. When I have conversations with people, average voters, I will say, not oftentimes leadership in these clubs or organizations, they're a lot more tied to one party or the other. Um, when I have real conversations with voters, I can have issues that resonate. A lot of times the money in politics thing is the big sell that is very bipartisan. People really hate money in politics across all political parties. I think on a more local level, right? Like as I said, we are facing a lot of the same issues that a lot of the country is facing when it comes to rising healthcare costs. To make it incredibly local here, after the big beautiful bill passed and there was all those cuts to Medicaid, the local hospital that is near my community, Lodi Memorial Hospital, is not
Hmm.
hiring people anymore. There's a hiring freeze. They're not bringing in any new nurses because they're not going to be able to pay for them because their budget has been slashed by the federal bill. And what that has led to is they're directing more and more people to emergency services. So it's crowding out our emergency room. So you're less likely to get timely care in the case of an emergency because non-emergency cases are being put there because they don't have enough doctors in X department, Y department, whatever, right? There are real consequences to these actions that seem like they have a partisan bent because that's the way they're covered, but they affect
Mhm.
people on a nonpartisan level. Everybody could have an emergency, right? And everybody would be affected by that. So when you talk about like the real issues of people, they're like, we should really be doing something about that. What is our representative currently doing right now? What are they saying on this issue? And, the representative that represents us has not represented us. He hasn't done any community town halls in like 8 years at this point. He's oftentimes out of district. 20% of the time, he doesn't even vote on bills. He's just doing something else entirely. Those are the
Mhm.
things that's like, regardless of what party you believe in, representation matters, right? They need to be doing and saying something on your behalf. And if they're just completely MIA, then they're going to be looking elsewhere. And that's what makes this candidacy viable. It's tough to get in front of people, though, and to have those conversations without money and without the connections and without the media attention. And that's why I'm doing things like this, right? To try and get my word out there as much as I can. I'm active on my Instagram, I'm active on my Facebook, and then I'm, doing the podcast circuit. I've done a number of podcasts since I've launched because that's the media that I can get in front of. Uh,
Yeah.
and we'll see how effective it is come November. It's been very it's kind of just running into a brick wall over and over again and hoping you kind of break through because the system is not set up for candidates like me to succeed. And
Mhm.
that sucks, but it's a worthy fight. So, we're trying.
For sure, for sure. Building some sort of like credibility with the average voter is certainly like a big part of the game, especially when you consider that a lot of people are not as partisan, and the same way that you explained.
Mhm.
There's another thing that I wanted to talk about, regardless of the money out of politics movement and engaging with all of that stuff. You did mention that you were an educator, and that was a very interesting thing to me because this is something that I actually quite, took an interest in before we had you on the podcast while I was doing my research. So when we talk about your teaching experience and the stuff that you've done generally throughout the past few years, how has it actually shaped your policy priorities when it comes to education? This is a topic that we hadn't actually brought up in the discussion yet, but when we come across, these different fields, you certainly talked about, your sort of not tech averseness quite literally, but your concern with whether these students are actually learning or not. Do you see the sort of corruption that affects us politically kind of dwindling down and sort of trickling down to the Reagan sense and making things worse for everybody, including students? Do you see the issues facing young people with this loss of communities, creating like the societal wide issue with our generation particularly being so isolated, and then these people grow up and they become politically dissatisfied? Do you think that's a loop that actually happens quite often, and what do you think about that?
Yeah, it really has affected my politics being a teacher. And I think a lot of teachers will say the same thing that we like to, not just in education, but in life in general, we all like to believe things will be better for the next generation than they were for the previous generation. And looking at education, it's hard to say that that's the case. We have less resources per student in just looking at California than the national average, and we have since the 90s. We rarely update our textbooks. We rarely have enough support staff. Our class sizes have been increasing. And meanwhile, we're also incredibly behind on our benchmarks when it comes to math, science, and English, which many of us would say are kind of all the core subjects. There's a few more there that we're behind on as well, but I could belabor the point. When you're in the classroom with 30 kids and you're one teacher who has worked, you got up at 5 a.m. and you're going to stay at the school until 5 p.m., grading,
Yeah.
making lesson plans completely by yourself, without a lot of teacher training. I came in, I was a first year teacher 2 years ago. I
Hmm.
didn't get a teaching credential. I had a substitute teaching credential, and then I started working at a Catholic school, so I didn't need a credential. I'm not Catholic myself, but because they don't require the credential, that's just where I ended up working. So it's not a
Hmm.
public education, but a lot of these problems exist both in private and public education. So, but you know, a grain of salt here. The thing that really is overwhelming for a first time teacher is the lack of support Teachers are incredibly kind and generous people. I think you kind of have to be in this industry because you have to really give a lot of yourself to your students. You have to make yourself very available. You are doing a lot of your work for free. You know, you're paid, but you're not being paid hourly. If you're working there until 5 and your contract ends at 3:30, you're not going to stop working at 3:30 because you have grades that need to be done, you have tests that need to be made, you have presentations that need to be put together, you have classrooms that need to be cleaned, you need supplies that need to be bought. That is a problem for every teacher across
Mhm.
every level, public or private. Teachers don't get that support. And when you do go out into the community and you talk to parents and you talk to students, not only do they not understand because they have their own lives, right? They're not really appreciative of that. And why would they be? Again, because they have their own lives, but it's really crushing to kind of like put so much of yourself out there so often and be rewarded so little. It takes a very certain type of person to succeed in that environment. Teaching is not alone in that. There's a lot of jobs that are like that. Um, but teachers are elevated, in a lot of ways is like, everyone says they respect teachers and everybody wants to help teachers. And so they say, right? But what are we actually like doing when push comes to shove? Like, are we supporting our educators? Are we supporting our students when it comes to education policy? Are we making sure that funds are available? Extra support staff is there. So it's not one teacher versus 30 students every day. It's hard to control those students in those situations, right? And you're
Mhm.
not giving access to proper textbooks. These are very outdated. Sometimes you don't have enough like science materials for everybody to do an experiment. It's very hard to get out of the teaching experience and think that our system is good when it comes to serving our students and our schools and our educators. Uh, so it really did affect my politics, and a lot of the things that I want to change about education come from my experience there. It's like we need to fund our teachers more to make sure that we can encourage higher quality educators to get into the space because teachers are just not paid enough right now. The people that are giving so much of themselves to this job are not rewarded. Turnover is higher than ever.
Mhm.
COVID didn't help. There was a lot of new struggles that came there that we're completely unprepared for, and we never got teachers back into the industry after that. So we've been operating at a deficit talent-wise for half a decade, and
Mhm.
it's really hurt everybody involved. There's so many things I can get into about how the education system has been really spiraling downwards for a long time, but yes, it's greatly affected what my approach is to education policy.
Right. That was a pretty succinct answer. I don't have any follow-up questions, but there's one more thing that I wanted to ask. So we have talked about a lot about sort of like the rural and the urban communities and how they have like this intersection where there's the stereotype that there's the West and East Coast liberals and then there's the rural working people in between and left right axis politics seldom goes above those very basic labels. But when it comes to District 9, which is I believe the district that you're running in, right? When
Yes.
it comes to District 9, with those rural and urban communities pretty much both included within that range, even though it is quite rural living, how do you plan to balance the needs of both of these, districts, parts of the district in your campaign?
Yeah, that's going to be one of the struggles because we haven't gotten into this too much, but we've hinted at there is a divide between the community needs of a rural area versus a more urban area.
For
I'm
sure.
trying to bridge the gap of what I talk about. Number one on my priorities, uh, that I mention to people when I'm out there campaigning is our water and agricultural needs. That our urban people, our urban voters, it's really not a concern for them at all. But if you're going to have representation in the legislature for a majority rural district, if I'm not going to be talking about it, then no other legislator is going to be talking about it. Or if they are, it's going to be from the purpose of like, we need our water to be piped down to Southern California because it's not being taken by, whoever, insert whatever special interest you want. We need to be able to fight for our farmers to get the water that they need cheaply while also protecting our environment to make sure that it's not ruining we have our delta. That is where a lot of our water is pulled from. We have,
Mhm.
many fishing areas around that place. We need to protect that sort of stuff. That needs to be a priority that's just mentioned all the time to as many voters as possible to remind them that like this is not something that you're thinking about, but if we're not able to get cheaper water, if we're not able to protect our environmental standards on this, water costs are going to go up across the board, which affects everybody. Everybody needs water. And if it's harder to get, California is a drought state. I mean, we have had droughts on and off almost constantly for the past 2 decades. And you can go back even further. That's led to increased wildfires. That's led to great harm to our state because we're just not good at managing our water resources. We have no official cap on like how much water can be pulled and from what area and who gets to maintain it. Ultimately, it's oil companies that maintain a lot of the water pumping facilities in our state, and they don't have our best interests at heart for all the reasons that we've talked about before. So
Mhm.
the way that I would bridge this gap is like you mention an issue that is a high priority of one community, and then you tie it into the needs of the other community in a way that they wouldn't necessarily think about. Because we're all going to talk about the same issues at the end of the day that everybody face cost of living problems, everybody face healthcare problems, everybody goes to school and has education problems. Everybody has water concerns too, but that's very rarely cracking the top three issues if you're going to poll people or ask them at the door, like, what's the most important issue to you? So you need to kind of to make a pun, lead people to the water on this because they will
Yeah,
see the truth on it. But if you're not talking about it, then they're not going to be there. And then the rural areas are going to think that you're not concerned about them at all if you're not talking about it. I knew basically nothing about water rights or the problem that California has when it comes to our water pumping before starting this campaign, but I knew it was a
Mhm.
priority because it would represent a lot of my district and my community. This would be a huge priority for them. So I read Cadillac Desert, which is a great book to kind of educate myself on water policy. I talked to, some local people who are farmers and water experts to get their opinion on this because I want to make sure that I'm representing these people properly when I'm talking about these issues. As much as I know education, I want to know what their needs are too. So that's been my goal, and people have been pretty receptive when I have broached these issues. So I hope that, they'll see my desire is real to represent both communities.
For sure. Yeah, sort of when you talked about leading the horse to the water, water issues and agricultural stuff and things like that, when you bring them up in a policy adjacent manner, it sort of feels to me as if it's mind the parallel between like a partner in an abusive relationship, and at a certain moment the other partner goes, well, you do this all the time, and the abusive partner is just like, well, name one example, and then you can't name a single example. It's the same thing when voters are asked, well, what do you think is the most important thing to you in politics? And they could have went through 10, 20 different things that they could have potentially brainstormed to improve throughout their lives. Someone could
Yeah,
be like an educator and they could have worked in healthcare before when they were younger, and they could have had a family who were farmers, and they could be like religious, or they could be irreligious. They could be like dealing with a whole lot of problems with their like electricity bills. But when you ask them all of a sudden, uh, it's like, geez, like, I don't know.
it's hard to come
But
up with stuff. Yeah.
yeah, and they could be very much like affected. They could be on the margins. They could be from a disenfranchised community. It's very difficult to think of stuff because normal people are not commonly asked for their opinion, which is very ironic when you think about the fact that nominally America is like a democratic system.
Yeah.
So those were all the questions I did have prepared. I wanted to get those out of the way before we finish the podcast. Jordan, did you want to riff off of anything that we were talking about just now?
No, but I agree when it comes to the idea of this statement that America is not quite as democratic as both it's made out to be and as it actually should be when we think about an ideal society. That I completely agree with you in that front. I think that corporate interests and the dominance, you could say, the outsized dominance of those types of interests are playing a major role in actually fomenting the crisis and in widening the gap, so to speak. That's
Awesome.
basically all that I would say about that in
Awesome.
general terms.
So I think we'll be ending it off real soon. So Matthew, just could you just run us down through like the brief timeline of your campaign? How long have you been doing this? What are your plans for the nearby future? When the actual election is? Stuff like that. Technicalities, please.
Yeah, definitely. So officially, I launched the campaign about a month ago. Unofficially, I've been putting together the campaign since about April. The next election that is going to be relevant for this race is the primary, which is going to be in June of 2026. So we've got a good amount of time here, starting very early to kind of, build as much name recognition and momentum as I can. Um, you can check out my website, Adams the number 4, assembly, ADAMS, for assembly.com, and I'll post any events that I have coming up that people can go to me. If people are in the area, they can get involved in that way. I've got a mailing list in my Instagram, also Adams for Assembly. I post about everything that I'm doing there. And then, of course, there's a donate link for people that are so inclined to help take this fight a little further than lack of funding would otherwise take it. Those are the things coming up that people listening can get involved in.
Awesome. All free links will be available in the description for those of you who are watching or listening. Listen, it's been a real pleasure having you on, Matthew. Me and Jordan both enjoyed both riffing and having like the long sort of discussion formats, but I also enjoyed having you answer some of my questions and hearing how you would target actual these parts of your district in this campaign. Obviously, neither of us are from California. We are very loud and proud Florida
Yeah.
residents as
Well,
of now.
I've spent time in
Mhm.
California. I have
You've
spent a
lived
lot
in
of time. I used
You've
to live
lived
there.
in
Right.
California, but
Yeah.
I've lived in like Germany and Britain. That doesn't make me German.
Yeah. I say I'm a bit closer to Florida at the end of the day,
Yeah,
though.
we are
From
very
South Florida,
we're
yeah.
Florida, man. We wrestle alligators at night. No, listen,
Right,
it was
Yeah.
right.
a real pleasure having you on. We do have some viewers and listeners from California, so I'm hoping this hits real close to home to them. And of course, if you want to keep in touch for the future, and we'll be sharing a lot of info about the campaign that you have in the video description. And we, of course, will be putting some stuff up on our channel along with the episode so that people know where to find you. Been a real pleasure having you on. I really did hope that you enjoyed this podcast, being able to be on the show, and that you will be able to take something out of this experience, as did we.
Yes, of course. This is a great conversation. As I said, I've been able to touch on a
Yeah.
lot of different things in this conversation that I just haven't been able to talk about yet. You guys are really great at setting up these conversations. Really enjoyed the free flowing nature and the questions as well. So yeah, this is a really great conversation, and it's been wonderful. Thank you, Jacob and
Yeah.
Jordan.
Thank you.
Great.
No, it
Thank you,
was amazing.
Matthew.
It's such a good time. Such a good time.